There is something about these final few games that almost make them feel like a precursor to a precursor. And what I mean in that sense is that unlike every other game in the series so far, these last few entries appear to build upon a foundation that was set up all the way back in Portable Ops. In a way, I guess you could say that's what all the games have been doing so far. Metal Gear 2 elaborated on the foundation of Metal Gear 1. The series then evolved with MGS1, which then had MGS2 refine that formula before having the series somewhat reinvent itself again with MGS3. And whereas MGS4 focused on streamlining and refining for the most part, it was still drastically different to all of the games which came before it. And that's the ultimate point. All these games were refining the core gameplay the franchise was known for, but it's the gameplay itself that was always distinctly different. MGS2 brought in first-person shooting, MGS3 had the jungle. I'm not going to say these last few entries are derivative, but there's a noticeable adherence to a certain formula with these ones that lasts right up until the end. And as we'll eventually see, I believe these all centre around the idea of player freedom, satisfying gameplay mechanics, and a large focus on the idea of building up an army, as was shown off in Portable Ops. Coming back to Peace Walker, however, this is a game that, as a Metal Gear fan, I've always found to be somewhat the dark sheep of the series. I mean that in the sense of mainline entries, obviously. This is a Metal Gear that was directed by Kojima, feels a lot more integral to the story at large, but equally, goes about how it shows everything off in such a weird way at points that it's never struck a chord with me in the same way that the other entries have. You'll see what all these elements are when we eventually talk about them, but needless to say, for me, they all revolve around three things: the gameplay structure, the look of the game, and the significance of this entry in terms of the series at large. Getting into the game, however, the game starts off giving us an idea of when this game's taking place, as well as a recap on the events which took place during MGS3, taking us to the year 1974, 10 years after Operation Snake Eater, and revealing in this opening text that after everything was said and done, Snake ended up just disappearing. This takes us into the game's intro sequence, with something I like immediately being how you can very much tell that Kojima has well and truly got his hands right back on at this point. From the very beginning, it does have that feel of a brand new entry to the Metal Gear series compared to a game like Portable Ops. Yeah, there's things like the far less detailed texture work that we can see pretty much immediately, but just look at the style and some of the choices that are made in this opening cutscene. Feeding into Kojima's auteur status, he starts the game off by making some bold decisions right away, regardless of if you might not think of them as such. Things like how Snake is now using a motorbike as his vehicle of choice, something which we'll see present itself once again in MGS5. Comparing the last PSP MGS outing to this, you'd also notice that not only did Portable Ops feature near to no cutscenes that took place in-game, but also what ones there were, they all look so bland and static in terms of their presentation. Whereas here, we're back to our close-up shots of cigars, clever use of environment, like when Snake reveals the MSF sign by hitting it round. And what we see is the re-emergence of the heavy adherence to the handheld camera style that we saw in MGS4. In terms of his auteur status, I would say these kinds of things are merely one part of what make up a Kojima title. If we're talking about the presentation in terms of camera work alone, I would say there's not as many things that stand out, although perhaps that's got something to do with the video game format itself. Let's just say, I don't think there's anything throughout the Metal Gear series so far that's made me describe anything else I've seen as Kojima-esque. Whereas looking to actual film, we're able to see that when someone uses something like a whip pan in a certain way, Wes Anderson is the main figure that would come to mind for most people. Or if you've got characters that speak a certain way, or shots that seem to zoom in on a sole subject, it could be described as Lynchian or Kubrickian. Kojima does have a style, but unlike other directors within the film industry, ones that Kojima himself most definitely takes influence from, I think it's the elements outside of that which make Kojima's style so distinct. The look of certain characters, certain traits that are shared between them, the quirkiness of the dialogue, and stuff like that. It's kind of why MGS4 felt like it stepped away from Kojima's style in quite a big way for a large part of it, intentional or not. The characters we met weren't as quirky, the environments looked a lot more generic. MGS4 perhaps proved more than any other Metal Gear game that the auteur status is very much warranted, as when comparing it to all the other games in the series, it did feel like something was missing in the initial few acts. So basically what I'm saying is, despite Peace Walker to some people seeming like just yet another PSP Metal Gear game, the opening sequence should tell you straight away that it's not as simple as that. Lest we forget, the team that worked on the Peace Walker project was not only just as big as the one found on MGS4, the look of the game obviously being deceiving in that regard when looking on the surface, but it was also said that during development, Peace Walker was originally touted as Metal Gear Solid 5, presumably with the title eventually being changed because of the console it found itself on, not being anywhere near as popular as many of the past entries in the franchise. Back to the game, however, this opening is very interesting when paying close attention to it, as it not only reveals where in the world Snake ran off to, but also what it is he was set on doing. Looking at the license plate on the back of his bike, we're able to see we found ourselves somewhere within the Americas once again. However, unlike the plate which reads Colombia, Peace Walker is actually set in Central America, specifically in Costa Rica. The sign Snake flips around reads Militaires sans frontières, translating to the phrase soldiers without borders, with us now seeing Snake's misunderstanding of the boss's will and going even further down the path we saw him take during Portable Ops, creating a PMC, or private military company. On the beach that Snake walks down to are some of these mercenaries performing a training regimen, and what we'll see throughout the game is how the core foundation of Portable Ops actually ends up shaping the direction of the rest of the series, but in a slightly different context. In Portable Ops, the purpose of building up your army was primarily centered around pushing back against the sole threat of that game, that being the Fox unit. However, it seems like Kojima takes that concept and ties it into the series story in a much better way, showing how Big Boss now looks at this idea of building up an army and creating somewhat of a hub for soldiers all around the world, as a way to both detach himself and push back against Zero and the Patriots. Again, this is one of those instances where if you want to play in chronological order, Snake's intentions appear to make no sense, as you're missing the context of why it is Snake's doing this after Snake Eater. Throughout the game, we'll obviously gain a huge amount more insight into what it really is Snake and the MSF are aiming to achieve. However, coming back to the scene on the beach, we bizarrely get the most obvious and conventional tutorial sequence we've seen in the series so far. Every other game before this tended to set up the scenario the player's getting themselves into and then let them roam free, leaving it up to them to figure out how the game functions and how to effectively carry out stealth and combat. The one exception, of course, being the plant section of MGS2, but we obviously know why that was. It's not a huge deal in Peace Walker's case. The tutorial explains everything well enough and gives you the chance to throw some of your soldiers around, which is always fun. But the idea of a tutorial being presented this way actually tells us a lot about the mentality Kojima and his team had when developing Peace Walker. Now, as I've already explained, despite not having an issue with this kind of tutorial, it's not personally the way I prefer the mechanics of a game to be conveyed to the player. They also did this in MGS3, detailing several mechanics that were obviously designed to have a sense of experimentation around them. However, you go too far in laying out what works and what doesn't, the experimentation disappears straight away. Again, I use Portal as a key example of a game that perfects that in my eyes. It teaches you and shows you the rules of the game while saying absolutely nothing about them, all while you're actively interacting with the mechanics and intuitively understanding how they work. In Peace Walker's case, however, I can understand a bit more why this was put in, as during an interview, Kojima said himself that the project was being aimed at a younger demographic. Now, it should be said, he mentions this in regards to the themes of the story, and how he became the director of the game to convey these themes in a manner that younger audiences would be able to more easily understand. However, it's clear to me at least, that this mentality isn't purely related to the story. We can see it right off the bat with this tutorial, and the gameplay mechanics that were given within this tutorial only reinforce that even more for me. However, we'll get onto them when talking about the gameplay at large in a second. After the training sequence, we're brought into a cutscene that brings back the fantastic illustrations of Ashley Wood that we saw in Portable Ops, these being just as great, and also in some ways arguably featuring the most unique and engaging scenes throughout the entire series, despite not being as grand or graphically impressive as something like MGS4's cutscenes.
What's going on, Kaz? We've got guests.
We're introduced to a familiar face in Kazuhiro Miller, being immediately interesting, with this being the first time we've seen him since Metal Gear 2, excluding MGS1 obviously, due to it being Liquid the entire time. And in Metal Gear 2's case, we're also aware that Kaz was actually helping Solid Snake out. Like Snake, he wouldn't have been aware that Big Boss was still alive after Metal Gear 1, but one thing he would have known is Big Boss's aversion to the idea of the Les Enfants Terribles project. Working with Solid would be an undeniable betrayal, so from the mere inclusion of Kaz, there's an interesting development left up in the air straight away. Big Boss and Kaz are teammates here, so what must have happened to destroy that relationship? From the very first interaction the two have, it gets established how this most definitely isn't the Snake we were familiar with in MGS3, with Kaz reassuring him it's not time to move out, after Snake anxiously thinks the people from Langley are here. This referring to the CIA, who notoriously have their headquarters based in Langley, Virginia. Snake doesn't just appear to want to keep a distance from these agencies, but it seems like he's wanting to entirely avoid the possibility of any possible inspections that may be asked of him and the MSF. The talk Snake has with one of his soldiers gives us a clearer idea on his mindset at this point, refusing the mantle of Big Boss and making it clear that their revolution isn't one with the aim of victory, but equally isn't one where they die either.
But in revolution, doesn't one triumph or die?
We don't do either.
The meaning of that being left somewhat up in the air, but for me, it represents the core idea of the boss's will, that being peace. Starting off, Snake appears to still be sticking strongly to the idea that just as much as they need to push back against these higher powers to establish a greater sense of balance, the aim isn't to be world dominant, it'll make them just as worse as the people they're fighting against. A far cry from the maniacal motivations we saw Big Boss pursuing in the first two Metal Gears. Snake and Kaz talk with the two people that showed up, one of which being a girl called Paz, and the other being Tank Dempsey.
We know who you are, Big Boss. Hoorah, maggot bags, you just don't quit!
No, I mean Galvez, with their talk pertaining to Costa Rica, and the organised armed group that appears to be creeping into the country.
You see, over the past year, there have been sightings of an armed group in Costa Rica. They're not ours, of course.
Article 12 of the Costa Rican Constitution is brought up here, revealing why Costa Rica itself was a vital location for Peace Walker to take place in, with it establishing that no permanent army can be maintained in the country, linking back to the country's pride over their more peaceful and pacifist values. The biggest irony, of course, being the ones who find themselves disturbing the peace in Costa Rica, with Galvez speculating it's more than likely the CIA who's sending in these armed forces.
I fear La CIA may be involved.
The CIA.
And already, we get the feeling the other USA-born force in Snake and Kaz are perhaps going to fan those flames to an even greater extent in the future. We're given more context on the situation Costa Rica finds itself in, as well as some more backstory on characters like Paz. The game very weirdly clarifying that Paz is only 16 years old when talking about how she was captured by those armed forces, before immediately giving us the ability to zoom in and see her undressed.
My God. She's Swiftana. Her mother died when she was small.
Two things there, one being the new interactive element a lot of the cutscenes in Peace Walker present now. As we already saw from MGS 3 and 4, I have a strong feeling the idea of players getting bored due to the prolonged length of the cutscenes in the MGS series has been a concern for a while. And despite being nowhere near as long and drawn out as what we see for most of MGS 4, Peace Walker arguably features the most interactable cutscenes in the entire franchise. You'll see as we continue that whereas before the interactivity merely came from a different point of view that can be shown off, or a flashback to something we know from the past, Peace Walker actually uses the interactivity to present the player with different outcomes to certain cutscenes, as well as what we see in this instance with Paz, in which the player is given the option to inspect the scene closer. And of course, the second thing, that being the bizarre decision to let us zoom in and see beneath her clothing, directly after clarifying she's 16 years old. There is an explanation that comes way later in the game that I suppose makes the decision to see Paz like this slightly less weird, but that's only when looking in retrospect. In the moment, it just feels wrong, I can't deny. So, the setup for Peace Walker is one that's filled with irony in my opinion. Two people who appear to value peace over almost anything else, coming to Snake and Kaz, and begging them to make the armed forces leave, or in other words, eliminate them.
Please, you must help us.
If your suspicions are true, force isn't going to do any good. You'll have to find a political solution.
The government's hands are tied.
The stakes, in my opinion, aren't really as grand compared to a large amount of the Metal Gear Solid games we've seen before, although I suppose that's kind of the point. It seems like we've said it several times so far, but I can't help but feel Peace Walker is just yet another example of how much Kojima realistically wants to move away from the Metal Gear series. We started with the series being purely revolved around Solid Snake, and by the end of MGS 4, it really does feel like that's it. There's no more story to tell. Any of the minutiae that may have remained from the origins of Big Boss all lead to the same point, with him dying at the grave of the boss alongside a cloned version of himself. Peace Walker, however, presents a similar kind of situation that I felt from something like Better Call Saul. Breaking Bad wrapped up very nicely. It tied up pretty much all loose ends imaginable. Did we really need to see an even more fleshed out version of Saul's backstory? Not really. However, that's not particularly the aim of Better Call Saul. Well, at least not for the endurance of it. It's not a show that's being solely made to enhance Breaking Bad. It's a show that rightfully went for something different, and as a result, achieved its own individual merits that were separate from Breaking Bad, with especially the opening seasons appearing to appeal to a different kind of audience entirely. Saul, in some people's views, surpasses Breaking Bad, and that's because it's not trying to be Breaking Bad, it's doing its own thing, and that is exactly how I feel about Peace Walker, and admittedly I've felt more and more as the series has gone on. Yes, Peace Walker does flesh out a certain part of Big Boss's backstory, but we're at the stage where we don't really need to see it, and as a result of that, we'll eventually see that perhaps more than any other Metal Gear so far, Peace Walker uses the Metal Gear franchise as a mere vessel to to employ certain ideas that Kojima and his team would have wanted to pursue. That's not to nullify or ignore the story elements, as they are very much still there, but as we'll see when looking at the structure of the game and what we experienced during our time with it. This is yet another Metal Gear that puts gameplay front and center for the vast majority of it, and not only that, gameplay that's spread across several different scenarios that don't relate to the plot in any fashion. Snake and Kaz eventually end up working with Galvez, being given a base of operations out in the ocean, but having Snake be incredibly cautious and unsure about the situation entirely.
They're willing to give us an offshore plant, a place we can finally put down some roots. This is our chance to expand MSF.
We don't need a place to stay, guys.
Not only does he fear that upon setting up a base of operations, they'll soon end up becoming warmongers, Kaz at this point showing off his almost politician-like attitude by switching the idea of MSF being mercenaries, and describing them instead as a new kind of business.
Listen to me, Snake. We're not mercenaries. We're not a foreign legion. MSF's a business. A new kind of business.
A very important thing to note about his character at this point, as this is something we'll see Kaz ends up doing several times throughout the last couple games. He's a character that, while being firmly on Snake's side, still has his own thoughts on how they should carry out their operations, using different kinds of words and rhetoric to downplay or justify certain actions. It's not just that, however. Snake identifies pretty quickly that Galvez most definitely is a member of the KGB. Lest we forget, the Cold War was still very much in swing during this period of time, and still finds itself as the main crux of the conflict we find ourselves getting involved in. America sending the CIA to Costa Rica due to their knowledge of what the Soviets are doing in Central America. The boss is mentioned, and actually heard over a cassette tape that Galvez plays.
I chase it away. It will bite you unless you kill it. Go home.
Boss. Voice sprint analysis confirms that this voice is indeed that of the legendary hero and criminal, the boss.
What?
We know for a fact that the boss is dead. We literally killed her ourselves, so there must be something else going on here. To summarize everything we see in this cutscene, after the shock of hearing the boss's voice, we see the manipulation from Galvez by threatening to burn the tape if Snake refuses to help them out, and also a reminder that it was the CIA themselves who ordered Snake to eliminate the boss. Snake pretty much goes against his morals and gets himself involved in a conflict that he doesn't really want to be involved in. The acceptance of this mission is well and truly the final thread being snapped between Big Boss and the USA. Unlike the boss, he's not staying loyal to his country, he's staying loyal to himself. He already clearly resented the US for what they made him do, but now it seems like he's going to be actively helping out the Soviet Union. He's defected in the most hands-off way possible. He's not loyal to either party, but appears to now have a sway towards the Soviets due to the offer that's being presented by Galvez. Snake tries to justify his actions by saying he's doing it for Paz, despite us obviously knowing that to not be true. Galvez informs us that Paz's story isn't false. She was actually captured by the mercenaries and tortured, and even despite that, and Costa Rica's lack of defense, Snake only accepts when it's something he cares about. This is the business that him and Kaz got themselves into, however. They're an army without borders, and an army without a nation. The whole point is that the country or organization they're working with are the ones that present them with the best deals possible, leaving Snake, Kaz, and the MSF better off by the time their work's done. This is why Snake would be hesitant towards getting their own offshore base. It may seem right now that their intentions are as simple as providing a service to those who want it, but once they're given a base of operations and start expanding to an even greater size, there's no telling that their ambitions might eventually be skewed. It's all well and good saying in the moment that won't happen, like Kaz tries to do, but Snake is most definitely right to question himself. If they don't want to become like one of the many other nations in the world they have an aversion to, it seems a wise choice to not resemble one themselves. The idea of setting up shop somewhere goes directly against the nomadic army without a country sentiment that lies at the core of the MSF, and that's one of the more interesting elements we see develop across the course of Peace Walker. We're put straight into the first mission after this, and from the terminology I'm using there, you may already be able to identify how this game lays out its gameplay, finally giving the player control and putting us in a scenario that resembles what we've seen from the past games. Let's not beat around the bush, but I want to talk about arguably the biggest component that I think turns a large amount of players, perhaps even ones who are part of the existing fanbase, away from Peace Walker, and that is of course the graphics. There's no debate that for a game that was released post MGS4, Peace Walker is debatably even less impressive graphically when comparing it to MGS 2 and 3. That might sound quite harsh for those of you who've played the game and know what's in store for us, but bear in mind, I'm talking about sheer fidelity here. As we'll see, I think for what Peace Walker lacks in terms of its less detailed textures, it makes up for in boatloads when looking to the art direction of the game. Now, many may see it as an unfair criticism, as it's fairly obvious these technical drawbacks are solely down to the console it was being developed for. The footage you're looking at right now is from the HD collection, featuring far more refined, smoother textures compared to the original. This is the PSP version, just as pixelated pixelated as many of the other games you would have seen on the PSP, while also being locked to 20 FPS. Now, I was a big fan of the PSP when I was a kid. Without a doubt, my favourite game on there was The Force Unleashed, which I think I actually preferred to the console and PC releases. That being said though, being a kid could have perhaps played a factor in that decision, as it was during a time before I was familiar or even cared about things like frame rates, graphic options, and all that kind of stuff. It can't be understated. In my personal experience, playing a game at frame rate 60 FPS and higher quite literally changes everything, and I'm sure many people will agree with that sentiment. Other gamers don't seem to care about frame rates, and that's perfectly fine as well. But just going back to a game like Gears of War now, for example, I was genuinely shocked at how low the FPS of that game drops from time to time. But coming back to the PSP version of Peace Walker, I have to clarify that before this video, I had never played this version of the game, and had only ever played it as part of the HD collection. And whereas the updated versions of MGS 2 and 3 were majorly impressive to me in terms of how clean everything now looked, Peace Walker felt like a game that lied somewhere in the middle. It very much is a HD remaster, not a remake. Everything we see in the game is the exact same as the PSP version, but remastered to look so much better, and also run so much better, staying at a consistent 60 FPS for the endurance of the game. Now for me, it's a balancing act, that I'll be honest, at points had me thinking the game looked perfectly fine, and at others had a pretty detrimental immersion-breaking effect. Let's just look at the first two areas we experience in-game as an example, those being the beach in both its rainy and sunny forms, and the jungle areas we've got to explore later on. Starting with the beach, we can definitely see that in terms of visuals, it's nowhere near as simple compared to something like Portable Ops. Portable Ops, for the most part, was very blatantly reusing textures, animations, and character models, and while that wasn't a problem, I think it arguably made the weakness of the game's look stand out even more, and comparing it to the opening beach section, we can see exactly why. Snake's character model, for one, has had a complete redesign. Obviously not to the point where you'd have to double take and question who his character is, but drastically different to what we saw from the Snake models in MGS 2 and 3. Remember, 2 and 3's were near identical, with me personally thinking that was somewhat due to the backlash seen from having everyone play as Raiden for the bulk of 2's runtime. Peace Walker, however, shows a far more grizzled Snake, featuring much longer hair on both his head and face, and much like Portable Ops, finally having Big Boss don the iconic bandana that him and Solid are best known for wearing. However, there is one drawback to his character model, and this goes for essentially all the character models we see in-game as well, and that's the almost complete lack of any different emotion aside from the stoic, pretty much emotionless one we see for the vast majority of the game. This is most definitely a technical drawback, and during the gameplay, there's not going to be very many times where you're closely observing Snake's face instead of just getting on with your mission. But the issue is, this lack of emotion is sustained during the cutscenes, leading to these fairly immersion-breaking moments where something shocking or dramatic is taking place, and Snake appears to be completely unfazed every single time. And no, I don't think there's even a single chance something like this would be remotely intentional. As we've already seen from MGS 3 and 4, Kojima's only become increasingly focused on the cinematic aspects of his games. The most notable example of this which comes to mind being that bridge sequence from MGS 3, describing character motivations and feelings with merely the emotions we see on the characters' faces. It's very rare you're finding that kind of stuff in Peace Walker. It's not a huge drawback, and it's one that for anyone who even remotely understands the hardware this game was being made for shouldn't be surprising at all. But when you've got a far more refined HD version running at 60 FPS on a much larger screen, these things do tend to stand out a bit more. All that being said, however, that's not to say this translates to the environments, as from what you've been seeing, you would have noticed there's many elements already that not only seem to be improved compared to the last PSP Metal Gear outing, but actually improved and expanded on from the mainline console games too, perhaps with the exclusion of MGS 4 of course. These would be things like the rain effects, the rain itself finding a good balance between the more blatant white lines that we talked about during the MGS 2 section, while still retaining the nice atmosphere that's presented from the rain, and how it interacts with objects and people, being able to see the rain splashing onto the ground, having it streaming down Snake's body, and appropriately throwing up a hazy greenish tint on the screen to reflect the misty, humid surroundings. Something else that's great, which applies to both occasions we're placed on this beach, is the beach itself and the ocean that rolls up on the coast. We've never experienced an environment quite like this in the Metal Gear series. Yeah, we've had jungles before, but as you can see, this area is what you'd call sun-drenched. Unlike most of the other places we travel to throughout the series, areas like the beach actually look like a borderline holiday destination, aside from the debris lying in the water of course. The ocean looks fantastic, with how we see the waves rolling up and crashing onto the sandy beach, all the debris appropriately getting pushed and pulled along with these waves. And once again, colour is used really effectively here to present a location that's aesthetically pleasing. It's far more easy on the eye than many of the other areas in the series, because unlike somewhere like the Middle East section during MGS 4, which arguably presents a location that appears just as bright compared to here, the colours don't quite pop in the same way, and intentionally so. It's something that I feel feeds into two aspects of Peace Walker that I've already hinted at, those being the technical drawbacks, with bright poppy poppy colours making the game stand out just as much, even despite the less impressive graphics, and also the overall structure and tone of the game. MGS4 is more than likely one of the most dour and depressing games I've played, so it makes sense why they were going for a more cold and realistic look for most of the game's locations, whereas Peace Walker at times starts presenting some of the most goofy and ridiculous moments I've seen from the series, so it's not a surprise that we've got a far more vibrant colour palette across the board. And finally, coming back to the mission at hand, we're brought to a jungle environment, which of course is heavily reminiscent of what we saw in MGS3, with everything from the similar flora, terrain, and also the sound of the jungle itself, taking us back to an atmosphere that we have already experienced. And whereas a game like MGS4 literally brought us back to locations we've been to before, Peace Walker perhaps suffers from a slight amount of derivativeness when it comes to these jungles. In the South America section during MGS4, for example, we weren't really exploring any jungle environments. There were bits and pieces here and there, but the overall look was more focused on rocky terrain and mountain ranges. Same goes for the Shadow Moses part as well. Exact same location, but totally revamped and given a brand new makeover. Now don't be mistaken, Peace Walker's jungle environments don't falter. I still think they look great. This is merely a comparison I'm making to what we've already seen versus what's presented here. It's not particularly innovative, and ultimately with the technical restrictions, we're no longer experiencing things like the wide and varied amount of wildlife, or the impressive god rays shining through trees. But taking it on its own, it's not bad in the slightest. The flow of the gameplay is something that feels fantastic in these areas, and we'll talk more on that when getting onto how the gameplay actually works. But let's say for now, this dense jungle we find ourselves in hides guards around several nooks and crannies, with players having to pay close attention if they don't want to be caught. Verticality is implemented in a way where Snake is oftentimes given either an advantage or disadvantage depending on who has the higher ground. And once again, it's the density which I think elevates some of these areas, I'd say far beyond even some of the ones in MGS3. I wouldn't say they're as difficult, once again due to aspects related to mechanics and gameplay, but the way they're designed seem to keep me on alert far more often. The corners being the key factor arguably. I assume once again because of the hardware, these areas perhaps couldn't be as broad and sprawling as what we've seen before. But if that's the case, it actually works to the game's advantage majorly, as with the lack of a clear-cut soliton radar system, and with there being so many pieces of terrain clouding our vision, you have to be constantly aware of where the enemy could possibly be. Reaching our destination, an area that lets us know we're not going to be solely contained to jungle environments in this game. Snake interrogates a guard, trying to get answers as to what cargo they're transporting and where it's heading. This cutscene presenting the interactive elements I mentioned earlier. However, as you can see here, it's not merely a case of being able to zoom in and personally inspect elements of a cutscene. This is the very first time we're seeing what essentially boils down to QuickTime events during the cutscenes. And I'll be honest, they can be very hit or miss. For someone like me, who never personally had a problem with how the cutscenes were portrayed in the past games, it can sometimes be quite frustrating that not only do I have to be constantly switched on with my hands on the controller, but what makes that aspect even worse is that these are unavoidable. It's not a case like the recent Spider-Man games, where failing doesn't really matter. Not only can these not be turned off, but if you fail, the cutscene restarts and you have to try again. That is frustrating in itself, but for Metal Gear, it's arguably something that's even more annoying because of the past games. I'm already accustomed and expecting these more drawn out cutscenes by this point, so to all of a sudden flip the script and have cutscenes that can sometimes be just as long, yet still feature QTEs in between. As I say, it can be frustrating. It's already somewhat of a noticeable annoyance from the QTE itself. I have never particularly enjoyed their inclusion in any game, let alone Metal Gear, and with it amping up what MGS4 did in relation to the flashbacks, it arguably drags me out of the experience even more. Not having my mind solely focused on the events taking place during the cutscene, but having my attention be divided between the cutscene itself and the possibility of another QTE flashing up. This first instance isn't that bad. A few button presses reflecting the battle Snake has with the guard, and a brief moment of tapping to reflect Snake overpowering him. That's fine. Would I rather it not be there? Kinda, but it's not that big of a problem. QTEs inherently are just a pretty bad idea to me though, especially mandatory ones like this, as when viewing them outside of my personal experiences, as due to me always being very familiar with the button layout of pretty much any gaming controller, I always know where every button and trigger that flashes up on screen actually is. The reason I think QTEs are so derived, however, and this goes beyond Peace Walker, is purely from the quick time element of it. I know for a fact that even people who are interested and enjoy playing games aren't always going to be the most experienced or technical players. The difference is, however, whereas in the actual game you're given the time and freedom to experiment around, make mistakes, and actually learn and overcome them, there's nothing like that in regards to QTEs. It's all based around pressing a button at the right time or tapping one fast enough. There's no skill, it's just reflexes and knowledge of of a controller's layout. There's many, and I mean a damn large number of video game players which I know for a fact won't have that same knowledge of where the X or square button is on their controller, having to constantly look down and check for themselves, kind of like some people do when navigating a keyboard. I'd argue, however, that failing a QTE purely because of that factor doesn't feel satisfying. Once again, there's no skill involved, therefore, the speed at which the game gives you an immediate fail state, especially when being compared to how the bulk of the game treats the player, will feel more like BS compared to anything else. These elements are still present in Peace Walker, but of course, I'm talking about QTEs across the board here. There's far worse examples compared to what's shown off in this game. However, I'm also not going to say they're all negligible like this first one, because as we'll see, there are some here that do feel cheap, do feel unnecessary, and have certain players genuinely aggravated at their inclusion. After this, we get our first taste of the brand new mech, being equally, and perhaps debatably even more bizarre compared to the ones we've seen before, featuring a strange, haunting tune that it sings almost constantly. And on the extreme side of things, it now appears we're being presented with the very first flying Metal Gear, potentially presenting a whole heap of problems in the future. With the revelation that the CIA are bringing nukes into the country, we're brought out of the mission, thus marking the beginning of Metal Gear's brand new adherence to bite-sized, digestible gameplay. The switch-up can be seen almost immediately upon emerging out of the loading screen, and it's a move that, while being practical for the PSP format, ends up resulting in the final big Metal Gear experience lacking a sense of momentum and weight to its plot points, something which I suppose can still be felt here, with me merely giving it more of a pass because of the intention. As you can see, Peace Walker's a game that does introduce some more modern gaming conventions that haven't really shown themselves in the series so far. The mission result screen making us aware there's now leveling, rank, and heroism systems in this game. The impact of all these we'll learn in due time, but just take a moment to appreciate what this screen is doing. We've been taken out of the scenario we were just in, seeing the brand new Metal Gear and realizing there's nukes on the island, and are now being told mission complete. Well, we know it's not, it's only just started. Of course, this is all because of how this game is structured, as upon coming out of this result screen, we're brought directly to our hub of operations, Mother Base. For those who played Portable Ops before this, it'll become apparent straight away that they're basically doing it again, this time with a far more stylish and simplified UI, well, at least from the initial options. We'll talk about the Mother Base itself in a second, but staying on the point of the structure right now, you can now see on the left hand side of the menu, there's now a mission selector that we can enter, giving us a list of all the missions we currently have access to, some of these being referred to as main ops and some being side ops. This mission select screen for me encapsulates what this game is really about at the core of it, a Metal Gear game made for a portable console that's simultaneously trying to be very ambitious, while also recognizing the format it's found itself on. I mentioned back in Portable Ops that the idea of segmenting the game into individual missions is a fantastic idea. However, at least in my case, that does not come from preference. It comes from an objective appreciation of a certain design choice. Handheld consoles have always been an issue for me personally, as the entire point essentially is to allow someone to play the same kind of experiences they enjoy at home, wherever they want. The key phrase there being at home. As you would have noticed in essentially every piece of marketing for the vast majority of portable consoles, there's always a large focus on showing people using the console in a park or on the bus. Me personally, I'd simply never be able to concentrate on a game when out and about, especially not a game series like Metal Gear that features these intricate plots and in-depth gameplay. But I understand some people will be able to, and for those who are looking to play this game while on the go, or on a road trip or something like that, the nature of having the gameplay and story laid out in the form of these shorter individual missions, compared to simply having to put a stop to the game when your time's up, is a brilliant choice. Along with the leveling system that we'll get into, there appears to be an adherence towards incentivizing the player, as well as giving them an almost constant feedback loop to keep them coming back. For example, say after the first mission we just completed, we're led right into the next one. It'd be fine, it'd work, and if the player finds themselves having to stop at that point, the game has an autosave feature, so they won't find themselves that far off of when they were playing last. However, with this mission system, we're not only feeding into that aspect, but also elements like the Mother Base mechanics, integrating VR type missions in a way so they tie into the main plot, push forward your progression, and give the player even more content to indulge in. But it's also the acknowledgement, the well done, you did it, that I think matters more than anything. Even if you've only got time for one small mission, you don't reach the end of it thinking, oh, I learned nothing from the last time I played and hardly made any progress. In a conventional game where it's one cohesive experience, unless you've played it before, you really don't know how long it's going to go on for. There's a kind of fatigue that can oftentimes set in if a game's too long, or perhaps if if it's failing to introduce new things to the player they haven't yet experienced. And if that feeling lasts too long, it's only a matter of time before the player stops coming back. It's a very mind-gamey sort of thing in my opinion. When being told mission 1 complete and are then told to move on to mission 2, it fits into that checkbox kind of mindset. Much like the more conventional game, not all of the missions are listed out here. We don't know how many main or side ops there are until we reach the end of the game. But it doesn't matter. That box being ticked psychology makes you think you've made a sizable amount of progress, compared to if you just snuck through an area of guards or had a radio call with someone. Not that it's going to work on everyone who plays, but as mobile games like Candy Crush prove, it most definitely works on a lot of people. And I'm not really going to criticize that approach in relation to Peace Walker, because there's just too many positives that outweigh the one negative that comes to mind. That negative being the immersive factor once again. The story that's being told is just as much of a journey as what we see in games like MGS 2 and 3, except now imagine MGS 2 having each strut you enter and exit being capped off with a mission complete screen. Even though I'm playing Peace Walker on a home console, but I can understand what the intention of this stuff was when it comes to the portable format. And even then, because of the mother base, they give you even more reasons that necessitate why the breaks in between missions are necessary. If the emphasis on progressing doesn't work psychologically, the mother base component is necessary to look at from time to time. After most missions, you'll find yourself actively wanting to take a step back and observe your weaponry and recruits. So yeah, the mission structure of this game could have some cons for certain players, but when taking everything into account and putting it in the context of the PSP, I'm left with not that much to criticize. It's about the best I could see this being carried out, even better than portable ops. Coming into the next mission, we're able to hear a mission briefing, this being the case with all the main ops throughout the game.
Snake, I rigged that radio so you can contact our young lady friend Paz.
Is she okay?
No need to worry, she's tougher than you think.
In some ways, these basically serve as the game's codec or radio moments, as in terms of the conversations we have in-game, they're nowhere near as varied compared to the previous games. I'll say now, the radio in-game is basically gone, being reduced to a mere button you can press where Kaz will throw out some kind of tip. Gone are the conversations about James Bond, or the secret calls we could have when inspecting something specific. Once again, it's not a huge blow to the game, and it's something else which I'm almost sure would have been due to the PSP's hardware, but it does have to be noted all the same, purely because of this game's mainline status. This is a Metal Gear game that's putting itself alongside those which came before it. Therefore, when these elements start getting stripped out, regardless of why, I think it's fair to perhaps be slightly underwhelmed. It's another reason why I think the removal of the 5 was a wise choice in terms of the title. There's many people who won't care about the caveats they would have had to make to even get Peace Walker working on the PSP. Despite the quality of the game when looking at it on its own, I don't think fans would be all that pleased being told this is the next chapter in the series, when there's too many elements that are either removed or heavily impeded. Our mission in this one is to find the Sandinista Comandante to try and get more information about where these nukes are heading, once again being placed back into the jungle, although being given a different set of areas to explore compared to the first mission. So, I think it's time we actually started talking about the gameplay at large, starting off with an aspect that links back to the mission structure once again. As you would have seen, unlike portable ops, the area in which you travel to is always dependent on what mission you choose. So whereas before you could go to places like the town, patrol base, or research lab whenever you want, Peace Walker is a bit more restrictive, which is what it is in my opinion. I don't have too much of an issue with this change, but at the same time, I could perhaps seeing it as being a bit frustrating when it comes to things like the mother base component. We'll get into the recruiting of soldiers in a second, but that mechanic does end up returning. Whereas in portable ops, however, where you could simply enter an area, take enemy soldiers, and then leave. With Peace Walker, you're having to enter a mission, take the enemy soldiers, and then complete the mission. Again, might not sound like a big deal, and for most it won't be. But for those who are looking to build up a sizable army perhaps quite early on, or are looking for soldiers of a certain caliber, you're gonna have to pick a mission and just get on with it. Again, nothing too bad obviously, but it still should be noted. Just like the prior mission, you'll notice that when leaving an area and heading into another one, Peace Walker appears to return more to the MGS2 style of doing things. MGS3 still had loading screens obviously, but there was most definitely a concerted effort to keep a large amount of the areas more open and sprawling, reducing the loading screens. With Peace Walker, it's important to distinguish the difference between the areas and the map as a whole. The areas being all the individual sections we make our way to, and the map being the result of all these areas combined. Taking that into account, Peace Walker finds itself somewhere in the middle of MGS 2, 3 and Portable Ops. Portable Ops surprisingly featured no loading screens whatsoever. The maps in that game were not only far smaller than most of the areas we've seen before, but they were also far less detailed and a lot somewhat denser. It was clear that a concession was being made, so these maps would have a continuous flow and not be broken up by loading screens. With my personal view on why that is, coming back to the recruiting system, with how dragging bodies between loading screens might have been a bit of a pain. Peace Walker's going for something more in line with the console games, while retaining the idea of maps from portable ops, if that makes any sense. Several missions will have you coming back to the same map that we're exploring right now, going through the exact same areas while carrying out a different mission. It's kind of like backtracking, but taken to an extreme, because it's not really backtracking, it's just a total reuse of an area that, story-wise, shouldn't make all that much sense. There's a set of missions, for example, towards the back end of the game, where we have to hunt down a target in several of these locations that we've already explored. In a story sense, it doesn't really make sense why they'd come back to these areas and how they'd get here in the first place. But in a gameplay sense, we obviously know these areas are merely getting reused, most likely due to a preservation of resources. So in those moments, the reuse can stand out quite substantially. But for the most part, the maps and the areas contained within them are all varied and quality enough to not be tiresome for a large part of the experience. Getting to the end of this mission showcases more what I mean about the immersion breaking aspect of interrupting missions. We find the Sandinista resistance, talk with the Commandante Amanda, get into a fight with the mech and some additional drones, and then are taken back to the mission results screen. Luckily that cutscene ended with the conflict at least being wrapped up, with Snake being left alone again. But that's the thing, when being brought back to the mother base or mission select screen, I think there's far too much reliance put onto the players by the actual game, especially with how they simultaneously introduce additional side ops after the completion of these main missions. It's almost begging the player to get involved in the external elements outside of the main story. For me, when I start thinking about it, I start questioning what our actual role is in this game, and if we're truly inhabiting Snake anymore, or are merely jumping into him as one of many potential vessels. It might sound confusing, and there's many people who might not even care, but the video gamey nature of these things merely doesn't work in these instances for me. It feels like a step too far. Assuming we are still supposed to be in the shoes of Snake when deciding what happens at Mother Base and what mission to select next, is that telling us that after every single mission, he packs up shop and heads back? Judging from the cutscenes, that's obviously shown to not be the case, but it's still contradicted due to the actions we can take after a mission's over. The only exception would be if we entered a side op after a main mission and a message comes up saying a few days earlier or something like that. But all I think it is yet another concession that the player's being forced to accept. There'll be some people who won't care about this, and there's others that will. But the undeniable factor of this is how it breaks the immersion. This isn't a case of a brief loading screen in between different areas. This is a situation where later into the game, Snake finds himself on the brink of high-octane battles. That gets segmented with a to be continued message, in which between that time, Snake miraculously finds himself out of that dire situation, and in a different location entirely. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of that. The example we just experienced for ourselves wasn't too bad, as I said, as the situation we found ourselves in had already resolved itself by the time the cutscene was over. But the scenarios where Snake is about to go right into a fight, only to show him right back at Mother Base making decisions, it just feels a bit too weird for me personally, and it's something that arguably only gets worse as the games go on. Remember, this isn't a case of me wondering what the intention is. That part is very clear. They're presenting what's basically a hybrid of main and VR missions, an opportunity to experience gameplay with story moments attached, or just some straight up gameplay, both of which benefit our Mother Base. This isn't an issue of pacing for me. You're never prevented from heading into the next story mission unless you personally start indulging in the side content. It's merely a matter of looking at what opportunities present themselves to the player with this amount of freedom, and how, upon reflection, the player may find what they're doing slightly ridiculous, considering the situation Snake finds himself in when it comes to the story. We're made to pursue this Amanda character in the next mission, the ultimate goal once again being to head from one area to another with multiple enemy threats in between. However, as you might have already seen, there's another component that ends up returning from portable ops that could potentially have a big effect in terms of the difficulty of certain missions. This being the mission prep screen, with both portable ops and Peace Walker presenting the idea of an overarching storage system when it comes to the items we pick up during missions, and the ones that we can develop at Mother Base. It might not seem that impressive on the surface, but what I essentially see this as is the most refined and straightforward version of the backpack and camo screens we saw from MGS 3 and 4. While those games present these options to you at all times, allowing you to pause the game, change your camo or equipment, and keep going, Peace Walker does away with that, making you pick your gear before you go into the mission, which I think is a great choice. My main issue with the way it worked before most definitely stemmed from how finicky the whole process was. It's already completely unrealistic, but even in the case of a game like MGS 4, which effectively streamlined the camo switching process, you were still being made to pause the game to buy and switch out your equipment. These These mechanics were constantly taking you out of the experience, making you wade through large menus featuring numerous pieces of other equipment to find the one you want. For a process that could potentially be taking place during a tense sneaking sequence or high stakes encounter, it always felt too drawn out. Peace Walker does away with that entirely, and I love the greater sense of planning this ends up producing. For many missions, you're having to pay close attention to what it is you're actually doing, and what you're going up against. Failing to do so could result in a complete roadblock, but one that's ultimately been created due to the player's own negligence. It comes back to a point I've mentioned previously about total player freedom versus forcing the player to take part in certain elements or mechanics. It's something that will vary from person to person. Some may think forcing players to experiment is good, and others may think it's restrictive. Either way, it requires the player to pay attention to exactly what it is they're getting themselves into. A good example of this coming towards the end of the mission we were just talking about, being told that in the next mission we'll be going up against an armoured assault vehicle, which by the looks of it seems like it's going to take a lot more than simply bullets being thrown at it. That's where certain positives start presenting themselves in regards to the individual missions. Yeah, there's the break in immersion, but if we're going in that more video gamey direction, we are getting these additional planning elements that still make it satisfying in its own right. We know we're going up against something akin to a tank, so the player now knows it might be a better time to switch out their uniform to something with more protection, and equip weapons that have more damaging, explosive properties. At this stage in the game, it's unclear if you'll actually have those things unlocked, but it's more the principle I'm talking about here. After a certain point, you'll develop the mindset of choosing the best equipment for the job, but as opposed to just going in blind, which again, I think is a really good element of the game. And outside of purely the planning aspect, it's nice to finally have a sole menu that compiles all the individual menus from the past, with the mission prep screen allowing us to change our uniform, weaponry, items, and character all at once. And on top of that, even when looking to these sub-menus like the uniform one, we can see how things have been even further improved when it comes to aspects like our camouflage, improving the experimentation significantly by not working with numbers, but grades instead. So whereas in MGS3 we knew exactly what camo was best for every single occasion, and in MGS4 the Octo camo heavily dampened the idea of individually choosing our camos, Peace Walker finds a brilliant balance by still having camos play a part in how much we stick out from our surroundings, but also introducing the planning aspect of the prep menu to not only have us paying attention to where it is our next mission's taking place, but what camo will suit best in that area, being given a vague idea from the grades beside each uniform on how effective it is in certain environments, but obviously presenting a slight risk in that not all areas in a map will feed into each uniform. It's a give and take system now in some ways, but one that because of its pre-planning nature now has less of an overall effect on the stealth gameplay. For example, whereas the jungle fatigues are said to be best in jungle environments, every other environment is marked as being B tier. It's basically multi-purpose, and as you'll see in my gameplay, this did result in me personally not interacting with the uniform system as much as I've done in previous games. The pros in relation to that coming from how the system finds itself being a whole lot less intrusive compared to how it functioned during MGS3, and the cons coming from the same thing basically. If a camo like the jungle fatigues can work in almost every environment imaginable, what's the point of switching it out? The only other option I could see being a positive for some people coming from the style of the uniforms, perhaps with some people liking the look of certain outfits while not having to suffer the more severe repercussions that were present in the previous games. Everything else is fairly similar to the backpack menu we've seen before. We've only got a certain amount of slots, the most important arguably being the weapons this time round, with almost all of the uniforms now, bar for the battlesuit, only allowing Snake to hold 2 weapons at a time. That's right, for the very first time, we're now being heavily restricted in terms of the weapons we can use from mission to mission. Now because of the mission structure itself, it's not that big of a deal. It would be a genuine problem if we're made to fight with a tank with the exact same gear we had while stealthing, but that's obviously not the case. I can sort of see what they're trying to do here, but I'll say now that if I'm right in my evaluation, there's still one big flaw that stands in its way. I've got a feeling this adherence towards having predominantly 2 weapons is a way to encourage more variety in terms of how the player approaches certain situations. The main reason I think that, coming from the other equipment that we can have aside from the weapons, being able to hold a number of support items like grenades, supply markers, and magazines to also help us out. The issue, however, comes from a contradiction within the mother base system, and the weapons that we still have access to. If the intention of giving us only 2 weapon slots is to somewhat reduce the reliance on weaponry, why does the mother base present us with the opportunity to unlock tons of weapons? There's so many here, ranging from snipers to LMGs to pistols. Not quite as much variety as MGS4, but not far off. Weaponry was clearly still an emphasis. They obviously want players to use these, as they wouldn't be here if they didn't. But the lack of weapon slots tells a different story. And on top of that, we also find ourselves back in a situation where certain weapons are just so much more effective compared to others. And wouldn't you know, one of the best weapons is still the MK22 tranquilizer pistol. The only thing really standing in its way being the suppressor that wears off rather quickly. But by the time you've leveled it up even once, the 8 shots it takes for the suppressor to wear out get shot up to 24. And paired up with the rather small area areas and maps that never tend to be completely crawling with enemies, you're gonna have to have some pretty bad aim to let this thing run out before you've already got everyone out the way. So overall, the mission prep screen is a pretty great addition. While I'm not sure how much the limited weapon slots will change a player's approach to a mission, or how much they'll now be interacting with the uniforms outside of which ones they think look the best part of it, far and away for me, is the planning aspect it presents, as well as the convenience of having all this stuff in one compact menu. Let's focus on that vehicle battle we were getting ourselves into, as it does a good job in showing off all the elements I just talked about, as well as laying out the general pattern for most of the boss fights we see in this game. Now, I'll clarify from the off that when it comes to these ground vehicle encounters, they are all incredibly similar in how they play out, always featuring a set of guards patrolling alongside the vehicle, with the main way to get rid of the vehicle itself being one of two things, those being an all-out assault using all the weapons we've got at our disposal, or the option to extract the vehicle when taking out a certain number of guards. Now in this first fight, that's all okay. It doesn't have the same kind of creativity that we're used to seeing in a Metal Gear boss fight, but it all still works well enough. My biggest problem are the future boss fights, to be honest, as outside of the more creative and unique boss types, these fights seem to always boil down to the same thing every single time. Either go hell for leather, or try and extract, with some of the boss fights removing the second option entirely. Sticking with this first one now, however, as I say, I haven't got many issues with it. We've got the option to either head straight for the vehicle and expose ourselves straight away, or perhaps more tactically, sneak around and try take the enemies out one by one. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the equipment you've got on you that will decide the approach you're going to be taking. And remember, the game's not going to do this for you. Are you going to try go for the stealthy extraction? Then you better wear an appropriate uniform and take your tranquilizer. Or, if you want to take the vehicle out as fast as possible, taking in your battle suit and a rocket launcher will most definitely be the better option. And putting that option in the player's hands is great in my opinion. Something else I like about the enemies here is the brand new enemy type that we see, those being the guards wearing protective helmets and armor. These will be more vital when cropping up in scenarios that are predominantly stealth based, but even here, it instantly puts a dampener on the tranquilizer, as we're no longer able to get that one-shot KO like we normally do. The body's still wide open for a shot, where we can either stick one dart into their body and just wait, or shoot multiple and watch them drop faster. Either way, shooting them in this fashion not only makes them suspicious, but with them also continuing their patrol route before falling asleep, it gives them an even greater opportunity to actually spot you, requiring a whole different set of tactics on the player's part. The best part of this for me is how the tranquilizer is no longer that get out of jail free card when it comes to these guards, as for many occasions in the past, you'll have a guard coming to investigate your position, who can easily be knocked out with one shot to the head. However, when it comes to one of these guys drawing nearer to your position, you're either going to have to pray the tranquilizer kicks in before they spot you, or use up even more of your ammo and suppressor, two things which are vital if you want to complete the boss stealthily. So the guards, they're very good, but when it comes to the actual boss, it's nothing we haven't seen before. It's really generic stuff, to be honest. The lifeless LAV-G does not make for a satisfying encounter in terms of stakes or functionality. The guards can basically be the primary threat depending on how you tackle the LAV-G, because as you'll see, there's a small warehouse in the arena which quite literally shelters us from everything the LAV-G throws at us. The rather slow speed and long wind-up times for its attacks, making it even easier to dodge all the incoming fire. The guards, however, can oftentimes offset that, running towards our position and perhaps pushing us out of cover for a brief moment, which is good. But outside of the two gas tanks we can shoot to temporarily stop the LAV from moving or attacking, it's just a straight up onslaught that will get us past this thing. The limited resources we can now take into missions would have been a problem, if not for the supply marker item. An item that I see is almost an acknowledgement of our pared down inventory in game, allowing us to put one down and have essentially all of our supplies restored. More ammo, more rations, more suppressors. It's an item that during boss fights can present a pretty intense and fun moment, where we desperately wait for more supplies to drop. But in the main bulk of the game, it can somewhat amplify a few issues that I mentioned earlier, one of these being the suppressors for the tranquilizer. As if it wasn't bad enough that the suppressor lasts for such a large amount of shots after only one level up. Even if we do run out, we can just place down a supply marker and keep firing away. I'm of the mindset that there needs to be repercussions towards our actions, that you shouldn't just be able to keep one set game plan. Much like those guards with the helmets, forcing the player to adapt can present a fantastic sense of creativity and on-the-fly planning, something which is nullified when it comes to equipment like this. To summarize, however, the LAV-G is just fine, and that's all it ever will be. It's a boss where even while fighting it, I felt somewhat underwhelmed, and once I was done with it, it was almost wiped from my memory due to how bland and boring the encounter was.
Target successfully neutralized.
After the fight, we get another ridiculous moment when talking to a wounded Amanda, where zooming in shows her without any pants on, and even inside of her skin to reveal her broken leg. And after that, we're tasked with going to find her brother, Chico. Before we get into that, however, I think it's time we talk a bit on the mother base system, with what we're shown at the start only being the very beginning of it. Now, the first thing you'll notice with the mother base, if you previously played Portable Ops, are the immediate similarities to the staff system that was present in that game. In Portable Ops, this is literally where everything takes place. You assigned your soldiers to individual units, and you would reap the rewards either in-game with the soldiers you can take with you, or the intel you can garner from different maps, or when coming back from missions, you could have your spies supplying you with ammo for certain weaponry. The point being that in Portable Ops, a lot of this is being done for you, whereas in Peace Walker, you have a lot more control, primarily when it comes to the R&D team, which debatably is the most important unit by far this time round. There's 5 main units that a staff member can be placed in. First will be the combat unit, who primarily help out with the outer ops that we'll get into later, but much like Portable Ops, these soldiers can also replace Snake during certain missions, with all their individual stats varying and sometimes even being superior to Snake's. The mess hall basically works as a collective bonus for all staff members, as if you've got a good number of staff performing their jobs effectively, thus providing more food to the base, everyone's morale will be raised and their stats will actually raise slightly higher. Then there's the medical team, who heals wounded soldiers obviously, and the intel team, which provides us with more supplies for our supply drops and lets us know what kinds of enemies are in upcoming missions. Look, let's be totally honest with ourselves, all of these are rather negligible, and I'd argue once again the game seems like it knows that. For me, with the multiple teammate system alone, Portable Ops had me far more involved with the whole staff system, despite it being less fleshed out. We're able to interact with this system in the same way in Peace Walker, but with the impact of most units here being rather lackluster, as well as featuring a brand new and admittedly wholly welcome auto-assign system that slots each member in the unit they'll be most effective in. The way I handle my staff members was usually just to auto-assign and then leave it, although I'd also argue that it might be a different story for someone who finds themselves not extracting many soldiers, which as we'll see later on isn't going to be the most likely outcome for most players, due to how easy and frequently encouraged it now is to take soldiers with us. But of course, I've glossed over the best unit of all in my opinion, that being the R&D team. This is what I perceive as a natural evolution off the back of what we saw in Portable Ops. Before, things were just being handed to us. Now with the R&D team and the separate R&D tab, we're being given more agency in regards to what items we want to develop, and what we'll need to acquire them. It's the R&D tab alone that I feel brings all the staff elements together, and turns this into a system that's just outright brilliant, and encourages the player fantastically to aim for particular goals, regardless of if they're necessary or not. Now I can say from experience, despite the wide range of equipment the R&D tab presents, you most definitely don't have to indulge in it to get to the end of the game. Much like the missions, the game in no way forces the player to indulge in external elements they might not want to for the most part. They're helpful of course, but you never reach a point where you're thinking, damn, guess I better unlock the rank 4 tranquilizer, or damn, I better do some more side missions. Even when playing solely the main missions, these elements will begin getting fleshed out naturally, especially if you're extracting a large amount of soldiers from these missions. But even then, after a while, you'll start getting a steady stream of volunteers, so for players who aren't interested in extracting anyone, you'll still have recruits lined up to take their place. Then comes the R&D menu itself, that while being slightly convoluted to navigate, presents us with arguably the most fleshed out and rewarding progression system the series has presented as of yet. It's no mystery to me why this is brought back in a near identical way for MGS5, as the incentive it presents the player with is so good. As I said before, this is mainly to do with how it ties into the staff management. Using the tranquilizer as an example once again, you'll be able to see here that the rank 4 MK22 is still locked. As we established from discussing the ranks earlier in relation to this weapon, these present substantial steps up in terms of how this weapon functions, and that goes for the vast majority of weapons that are on offer here. There's not a lot of clarification given to this in the actual game, so excuse me for perhaps the more broad evaluation, but what it comes down to basically is higher numbers means better weapons. There's a difference when it comes to the levels and the ranks of these weapons, the level representing how much you've used the weapon, with level 3 being the max, and the rank being the static upgrade that you unlock from the R&D menu, presenting things like damage increases, more durable suppressors, larger ammo pools, and stuff like that. This distinction is important to make, as we've already mentioned before how in the case of something like your typical Call of Duty weapon progression, those systems are directly tied to how much you use the weapon and how effectively you use it, that being common for most games that feature weapon unlocks. That's not the case here however, it's instead linked to your staff and a currency known as Gross Military Product, GMP for short. Every locked piece of equipment will tell you what you're lacking, whether it be the funds or a unit that isn't a high enough level, and that is the best part in my opinion. The feeling of upgrading your arsenal, arguably even for weaponry that you don't use, is satisfying in itself. It does feed into that number going up kind of feedback loop, which companies like Bethesda seem to have perfected in regards to games like Fallout and Skyrim. Just like how it feels to build up your staff, being able to see your allies' ranks naturally getting better better and better the further you get into the game. It's a great feeling to unlock a new weapon, or a new version of a previous weapon that feels even more powerful compared to what you were using before. I feel there is somewhat of a push to get players to use certain weapons they might not particularly want to, but again, it's gone about in the right way. If you notice, there's certain weapons here that don't feature certain ranks in terms of their progression. The example you're seeing now being the non-lethal M1C sniper rifle. To unlock this one, you first have to unlock the lethal versions of the M1C, that as I say, you might not have any interest in using. However, if you look at it more as an investment, you can see how that M1C is merely a gateway to unlocking both a non-lethal sniper that can be an incredibly useful weapon for picking off guards from a distance before extracting them, but also, if you're merely not happy with how that M1C functions and still want a lethal sniper, beneath the non-lethal one, you can see an entirely new sniper, that being the M21, can also be unlocked. So it's not just progression in relation to making pre-existing weapons better, but it's through that system where we can unlock brand new weapons entirely, which is brilliant in my opinion. And needless to say, the unlock requirements for some of these tie right back to the staff system, and genuinely will have you re-evaluating your staff members, and having to decide which ones stay and which ones have to go. There'll come points towards the back end of the game where the only thing standing in your way between another weapon unlock is the level of your units, in which I can then say elements of the game which may have seemed rather useless during the main game become a lot more vital. Things like how the intel team can inform you what the ranks are of the enemies in particular missions can be invaluable when wanting to create a stacked unit. There is an argument in relation to some people finding this somewhat pointless if you can already complete the game without utilizing this stuff, but that's something that I feel will just vary from person to person. As you can tell from the addition of all this stuff, Peace Walker's presenting a different kind of experience compared to a lot of the Metal Gears that came before it. It's focusing on ideas like leveling up, upgrades, and all that kind of stuff. And I think the devs have a very clear understanding that there'll be a large audience who will be interested in that part of the game, even if they reach the end. It's that whole idea of endgame content. There's a lot of gamers who'll get to the end of an experience and still be left with boxes that haven't been checked, items that haven't been leveled up to the max, and solely because of that fact, they aim to achieve it regardless. But aside from all that, whether you're achieving these unlocks and fleshing your units out with S-rank members before or after you finish the main story, the ultimate point is the incentive in all this. It's broad, it encourages the player very well, and shows how when you combine these two tabs, the system as a whole is elevated to an exponentially higher degree. That is just the start of it, however. We'll get into how these tabs affect other mechanics in this game a bit more later on. Moving on to the next mission, you would have noticed so far that we haven't really focused all that much on the story, and that's because, once again, we're at a point where the Metal Gear series appears to be a whole lot more interested in gameplay, compared to the drawn-out story sequences we saw from games like 2 and 4. Now, you could say that comes down to the format once again. The PSP did have the ability to watch movies on it, quite a unique little feature at the time, considering things like the iPhone and all the streaming services we know today were either in their infancy or hadn't even come out yet. Peace Walker does feature some pretty long cutscenes from time to time, but I'd argue that for the vast majority of them, they're rather compact, and the largest amount of dialogue we get is featured within the mission briefings. The game is still in its early stages, to be fair, but I'm not expecting anything too deep for now in terms of the narrative, but I feel this is still the general pattern with Peace Walker. The main thing I take away from it is yet again the core themes, those being the anti-war and anti-nuke messages that lie at the core of this game, as well as how it all ties into the literal events of the series, the latter of which I feel is the more important, omnipresent aspect of the story that resides over the whole experience. Unlike Portable Ops, there's moments in this game that are intentionally being written to show Snake's transition into the villain we know from Metal Gear 1 and 2, and coming into the next mission, we do get a taste of that in quite a big way. In terms of the mission itself, we're in the jungle again, this being the last time I mentioned that fact, due to quite a large number of the missions finding themselves in this environment. However, despite the similar appearances, some of which literally just being the same areas we've already explored, it is still important to note the ones that differ from what we're used to. It starts off with the extremely dense forest environment once again, where I'd argue that despite the lower quality of the textures, the sheer amount of green leaves, grass and plants, and the wide variety of these to boot, might actually surpass the likes of MGS3. It's one of those things that upon reflection creates that incredibly claustrophobic atmosphere, and something else I like a lot as well was the unconventional nature of the environment itself. Specific stuff like the trees being a good example, with how there's not only variation in terms of the ones that are spaced out and ones that are much closer, but also the trees we see completely knocked over, presenting both a good visual, but also a possible obstacle in the way of seeing enemies, or perhaps a piece of cover to hide from them. The next area is even better in my opinion, this being an area that's almost the complete opposite from the last one, presenting a far wider area, with the only real forms of cover being the crates that are lying around, or once again the trees and broken off pieces of wood. And not only that, we can also see there's a sniper here, presenting an idea that hasn't really been focused on since MGS2 on some of the connecting bridges, giving us a threat that lies totally out of bounds. However, unlike in MGS2, where the guards who overlooked the bridges were given this huge cone of vision to let the player know they were being being watched. Peace Walker has none of that, with threats like this only having the potential to remind the player even more that this is a stealth game, and that they shouldn't feel comfortable running around freely without getting caught. The final area takes us to a small village, where once again, the game presents a nice deal of variety over only 3 sequential areas, while at the same time, still having it feel cohesive. The village perhaps being my favourite, primarily due to all the houses here, once again serving as a form of cover to make our way forward, but also having these tight alleyways and narrow corners that hide the enemies too. Snake eventually ends up finding Chico, in which we're shown the first genuinely shocking moment from his character so far, that being the moment where to make a point to Chico about choosing life instead of death, he points a gun right at the kid's head and says the Chico he is now is dead, beginning his journey as a new man.
I wish I was dead.
Okay then, I'll put you out of your misery.
What?
Any last words? I just wasted a bullet. Don't waste your life.
The worst part about all this coming from what it is Snake ultimately wants. It initially seems like he's just trying to get Chico back to Amanda. However, his intentions become a bit clearer upon saying Chico will come back and fight for him, with Chico himself calling Snake boss by the time the cutscene's over. And although Snake still shows an aversion to the name, what we witness is Snake quite literally recruiting a child soldier. One thing I pick out from our conversation with all the characters afterwards, and something you might have noticed throughout the game already, is how Kojima has once again reinvented this character of Big Boss to reflect the mindset and position he now has. It's very subtle, much like the difference between the 2 Snakes in MGS 2 and 3, but when looking closer, we're able to see the Snake we witness in Peace Walker has a far more dominating and demanding presence. Solid was mostly just an observer, his main goal was always the mission, and only towards the back end of MGS 2 did we start seeing him give advice to Raiden. But again, that's all it was, advice. In MGS 3, we've got a Snake who's nothing more than a grunt. He's mostly answering other people's questions, compared to asking his own. And then, in Peace Walker, we've got a Snake who sounds like he's got a supreme degree of confidence, and an authoritative persona. He's the one calling the shots. Just listen to the way he talks to Amanda here. He begins the conversation saying this is merely a word of advice, but we can see that it most definitely isn't.
Amanda, a word of advice.
What?
Stop treating him like a child.
Yes. Yes, I know. You're right. I shouldn't.
Well then, you're gonna have to stop treating Chico like a brother, and start treating him like a soldier.
You're right.
Welcome to hell.
That's a straight up command by Snake at the end, one that she ends up following. It's a part of his character that does genuinely end up bolstering the whole building up an army angle of the game. The partnership Snake and Kaz form shows one man continually going out onto the battlefield to hire new recruits, and the other who stays back and keeps everyone in check, building up the mother base and presenting Snake with new ideas over time. Despite still performing similar actions to ones we've done before, it's one of the first times where both Snake's and also our motivations aren't being done to further some ultimate goal, like saving the world, or being a lapdog to organisations who don't really care about us. A sense of control is given from that fact alone. We still have the whole Peace Walker and Nuke side of the game, but it's an operation that we're carrying out ourselves. There's no intermediary who's telling us what to do. Up next, we're made to yet again travel back on ourselves, eventually reaching another more unique area that should switch up our playstyle a bit more. That being the more industrial warehouse area we find ourselves in upon emerging out the jungle. From the very grey and brown tones that we can see make up this area, we can already see how certain camos might be able to work more effectively. A mental note perhaps being able to be taken by the player for any future occasions we find ourselves coming back to these previously unknown areas. This warehouse location in particular is great in reintroducing threats that we bear witness to in previous missions, and putting them in a slightly different context. For example, that sniper I mentioned earlier wasn't supposed to purely be an indication of how there's a possibility for snipers to be lying around. It was meant as a way to slow the player down, and remind them that enemies aren't just going to be wandering around the playable area, but also lying in wait on top of mountains, or in this case, up on walkways.
Enemies close by!
This verticality being even more blatant when heading into the warehouse itself, being able to head up to the next floor via one of 2 ladders, in where you have to be very aware of your surroundings. Not only to not get caught from enemies that lurk on the ground level that could potentially spot you climbing up, but also the enemies that may be waiting for you when you get to the top as well. Our final objective when reaching the goal was to neutralise all the enemies in the area, so I think with that, it might be a good time to finally go over how the gameplay works in Peace Walker, and see what elements of the gameplay have been expanded, and perhaps some elements that have regressed to a certain degree. Starting off, when comparing Peace Walker to the last PSP Metal Gear outing, I'd say this game definitely features the more unique and well-constructed gameplay in my opinion. However, on that same merit, it also needs to be noted that to achieve this effect, there's elements from portable ops that had to be pared back significantly, or removed entirely. Two of the most notable in my opinion being the crawling, a staple from the Metal Gear games, which has now been reduced to having Snake lie on the floor without the ability to move. And also the first-person aiming, something else that's pretty much a staple of these games by this point. That's the thing though, Peace Walker doesn't remove these elements out of necessity. Portable ops already proved these were possible to implement, but instead, they do it for the purpose of functionality. Remember, this is a game that first and foremost was being created for the PSP. There wouldn't have been any talks during development about the HD remaster that would come to consoles several years later. And from my own experience with portable ops on the PSP, I can say right now that doing things like aiming in first person was definitely not the most pleasant or easy thing to do. The first person effect, while being nice in relation to the whole Metal Gear on the go side of things, it just didn't feel that good to control. So as a result, they've done away with it in Peace Walker, and instead took notes from what they were doing in MGS4, and decided to go for the over-the-shoulder third-person shooter approach, which ends up working incredibly well. And as for the crawling, I assume this was just removed due to the overall pace of the gameplay. As you might have noticed, the flow of the gameplay in Peace Walker is actually rather fast-paced. The areas have been designed in a way where you aren't going to be crawling under small crevices to avoid the enemy, so although I don't think the inclusion of crawling would have harmed the game really, the re-emergence of the crouch walk that we saw in MGS4 makes up for it in a big way, presenting almost the same degree of covertness this time round, while being a whole lot faster as well. Again, this may purely stem from a stylistic direction that Kojima and his team were starting to head in. We had 3 of the mainline games have a total emphasis on slow-paced tactical scouting and movement, and with this switch beginning in MGS4, it might simply be a case of the series naturally evolving, still requiring the player to be tactical, but also presenting them with the option to be speedy as well. And with how we see MGS5 deals with its gameplay, I don't imagine I'm that far off. I mentioned the shooting a second ago, and it's always something that when I come back to Peace Walker I'm initially hesitant about. Now don't get me wrong, it is pretty much the same as what we saw in MGS4, but with this game lacking the first person aim entirely, you can very much feel a form of aim assist is being given to the player when taking your shots. You'll notice that for a game that doesn't have the precise iron sight scope for us to target the enemy's heads with, you'll find that more often than not, even despite that crosshair being really quite wide, headshots might actually be an even more frequent and easy shot to pull off. Again, this is all coming from my personal experience, but there was absolutely no issues for me regarding anything in relation to inaccurate aiming or strange bullet placement, which is why I make the assumption there's a heavy aim assist at play here, as the size of the reticle literally makes precision nigh on impossible. The shooting is damn satisfying though, although I'll say again, this is in relation to my experiences on the HD remaster. Lest we forget, people who played this on the PSP would still have to be using that horrible analog stick and awkward D-pad, something that I assume was a big concern for the devs, with them also presenting a fully automated aiming system as well, that while not being as accurate obviously, you can assume would have given many players a much easier time on the PSP itself. In terms of sheer innovation, there really isn't that much to see to be honest. Almost everything here is being brought over from MGS4. The crouch walk, the aiming system, the ability to move while aiming, everything is very solid, but it's also nothing we haven't already seen. And that's also perhaps where some of the more negative factors come in for me, as it's not just a matter of seeing things return verbatim, but there's also certain elements that return that are made a whole lot more telegraphed compared to what we're used to. Bear in mind, I said these are a negative for me, although it's one of those things where for other people, they might either see it as irrelevant or an actual positive. What I'm referring to are the button prompts that frequently flash up on screen now in relation to interacting with objects or dealing with enemies. And once again, it's more the immersive aspect that's my biggest issue in relation to that. I found it a lot easier and a lot more natural to just press ourselves up against the surface and have Snake do it automatically, as opposed to activating it manually. But it's more the big orange pop-up at the bottom of the screen that just sucks you right out of the experience, and reminds you over and over again that you're playing a game. I'm sure it won't be an issue for everyone, but it's still something that bugged me personally. And when it comes to the button prompts in combat, I just see these as totally unnecessary. We're still able to do that 3-punch combo from MGS 3 and 4, but now when it comes to grabbing our enemies or throwing them on the floor, a button prompt comes up on screen highlighting the buttons we need to press to both grab and interrogate the enemy. Why do we need this? It was perfectly fine before. All I could see it being in relation to was the younger audience once again, highlighting things they otherwise might not know how to accomplish, but I'm just not sure. On one hand, I can appreciate the clarity, but on the other, it seems a bit too gamey for me. I know some people might argue that because it is a video game, that shouldn't really matter, but I disagree with that view. Immersion is a very key component to lots of games. It's why you see ones like the recent God of Wars giving you the option to switch off the HUD entirely. Even in the most whimsical, unrealistic worlds, developers more often often than not want the player to be drawn in and believe the world they're witnessing. The kind of automation I'm referring to in Peace Walker draws me out temporarily, and once repeated enough times, draws me out significantly, with it being all the more obvious in this case due to how these same processes have been seen before without these kinds of button prompts. I mentioned the HUD however, and that's something that definitely shouldn't be overlooked in this game, as I think how the UI is handled in Peace Walker will be very hit and miss for a lot of players. We already talked about the mother base menu, that while getting elaborated on as the game goes on, and not having the most easy to read R&D or staff menus, still lays everything out quite clearly. Same goes for elements like the loading screens when journeying between different areas, having a nice mix between the map systems that have oftentimes been terrible in the Metal Gear games, and just a straight up load between areas. It lets the player very clearly know where they're going, where they've come from, where the goal is, and what routes are blocked off. Great stuff in negating the confusion that can sometimes present itself with these games in relation to where the player is supposed to be going. Then, coming into the game, I'd argue this HUD is a mixed bag. Now, is this HUD slightly more intrusive compared to the HUDs we've seen in the past? Yeah, I guess so. Even despite the brand new vertical design, the health bar and username on the left hand side could have been refined by removing the username entirely. And in terms of our equipment and weaponry, there is a whole lot of stuff here that could have been pared down. The boxes in no way have to be this big, especially when looking at the equipment and the camo index at the top. Just look at how much black empty space is there. It is translucent I suppose, but it's still clouding the actual game. I think the same goes for the weapon as well, being the biggest box of all of them. The while featuring some useful information, like what weapon we're using, how many bullets we've got, the durability of our suppressor. Let's be honest, this stuff in the past was either so irrelevant that we didn't need it to be conveyed in this way, or was a minute detail that didn't require this amount of space. The blue and white non-lethal and CQC boxes for example, these were conveyed perfectly in MGS4 by colour coding our weapons, and having the tiniest CQC label in bright red. I think it's irrefutable to say there's not elements here that could have been refined and minimised to create a far cleaner UI. However, at the same time, I never had that much of an issue with it. The vertical design presents one of the more unique layouts we've seen, and when looking at what's actually there, we still admittedly have all the accurate illustrations and clear-cut info that we've seen before. The thing I'd say I hate the most about all this, however, is how we select our different pieces of weaponry and equipment this time round. Metal Gear, perhaps more than any other game I've played, sticks out as having one of the best quickfire weapons menus in gaming for me. Just think about it in terms of MGS 1 and 2. You hold down R2 and there's literally all of your weaponry, being able to flick between each one with ease. Now obviously, with how the weaponry and equipment has only gotten more broad over the last few games, it's not as simple as that, but that is in no way an excuse for how Peace Walker deals with the weapon selection, as ultimately, they're limiting the amount of things you can take into missions even more so. The main problem is how awkward it now feels, and I don't just mean when comparing it to the previous games. What might have been a good call for the PSP results in a screen that clouds everything in the background, something that now becomes a much bigger problem because of how the game continues on even while you're selecting your equipment. That element of it in itself I think is great, keeping the player directly in the heat of the action and forcing them to either make sacrifices on the battlefield or take the risk and look through their equipment. But again, it's somewhat dampened from the fact that we can hardly see what's going on anyway. And what I perceive as the most tedious element of this links into an aspect of the game that I'm aware many players have a big problem with, that being the controls. There's 3 different control schemes to choose from in this game. The one that I myself, and I assume the majority of players will be using, being the shooter type, that emulates your standard third-person shooter. However, that doesn't mean it's emulating MGS4's control scheme, as you'll find that when it comes to things like the D-pad and the action buttons, they've been remapped to the point of almost being useless. With multiple functions now being mapped to things like the right trigger, we find buttons like the square button having an identical functionality to that of the select button, that either being a radio call, activation of the auto-aim, or co-op communication. And with the game now having an even more shooter-based control scheme, now using the triggers to aim and fire instead of the bumpers like we saw in MGS4, the bumpers now become the way to select our weapons and equipment. Already, but on an Xbox controller like I'm using, that can be a genuine pain because of how clunky I find the bumpers to be on that thing. But hey, we can write that off as an Xbox issue. What is an issue in regards to the game, however, is how we select these items. Not being the smooth, clear, and snappy scroll up and down, but instead a weirdly shaped vertical menu once again, where you have to tap, tap, tap along until you reach the item you want. In my opinion, I think it looks and feels so much worse compared to how it's been treated in the past. It feels more awkward to navigate, it hasn't got any style to it. There's about a second pause when holding in either direction before the game understands you want to go to the next item. And in my opinion, one of the aspects that annoys me the most is the identical illustrations we get for numerous items. Look at the supply and strike markers, they're literally identical. And I know you could say, well, just look at the text, but when you're in a high octane situation where the game now doesn't pause, you can understand how it could become quite a frustrating and rather frequent occurrence getting the two mixed up. And hey, saying all this stuff, you might still be thinking it doesn't sound like that big of a deal. And I agree, on the surface it doesn't. But when you're playing a game that could last for hours on end, these annoyances do start to build up. Especially if it's an element of the game like this, where players are going to be interacting with it on a very frequent basis. So yeah, the weapon selection screen is not to my liking at all really, even when taking into account the accommodation it was likely making towards the PSP once again. Not the worst thing in the world of course, it's not like it's unusable, just not very good is all. Finally, going back to the shooting mechanics in this game, there's many things which are implemented here that just make gunplay on the whole very satisfying. The auto-aim which I mentioned a second ago is surprisingly one of them. I say surprisingly, but as for myself, as well as many other players, the idea of being in control was something that can be very important. While playing a game, you want to feel like you were the one playing it, and that it's not just playing itself. And I'd say the auto-aim is somewhat perfect in that regard, presenting a great balance, where if the majority of your reticle encompasses the enemy's head, you'll more than likely notice the reticle split in two, one representing where you're actually aiming, and the other showing where your bullet's going to end up, that being to the enemy's head. It's the balance that feels the best of all, however. It never feels too strict to where you're aiming in a well-off direction and still somehow hit your target, but it's still loose enough to where you're basically having to aim directly at the enemy's head, where the game then realizes this is where you're aiming and carries out that action. Yeah, it kind of throws things like timing out of the window, as the game at that point has your aim locked. All you have to do is pull the trigger. But even with the removal of first-person aiming, what we have in Peace Walker is far superior in my opinion. And then there's elements that make taking out enemies just that bit more satisfying than I think we've ever seen before. What I'm referring to are the bright pop-ups we get whenever we land any kind of shot on a target. Red being for a lethal hit, blue being non-lethal, and white representing when no damage has been dealt at all. It's a very arcadey inclusion, and one that's not all that necessary to be honest. We've never needed a notification telling us we've got a successful hit before, and we most definitely have never needed the accompanying numbers telling us how much damage we're dishing out. But regardless, it's less about what this information is actually telling us, that being hardly anything at all. It's more about how your successful headshot or rocket strike on a vehicle is now made just that bit more satisfying. As I say, the numbers that are given out are laughably irrelevant, as it's not like the game is actively pursuing the path of an RPG, where you're getting loads of critical hits and you're seeing what value the enemy's health is at. There's nothing like that. Enemies still have no health bars, and bosses just have a set number of blocks that chip away one by one. Although saying that, looking at Peace Walker under the lens of that whole RPG angle, we can see there are elements that would fit in with an RPG, so perhaps things like the damage notifications are merely a piece of influence that lacks any real meaning. The mother base, for example, is all based on leveling up your units, getting weapons and equipment with higher ranks, recruiting soldiers with more impressive stats than even Snake. It's got those RPG kinds of elements, but again, we're not leveling up Snake's stats or giving him different traits as the game goes on. The influence appears to be there, but in no way do they pursue it in any heavy fashion. Overall, the shooting mechanics feel smooth, satisfying, and refined from the last PSP Metal Gear outing. And looking at the gameplay overall and how Snake functions, it's nothing we haven't seen before. But as I mentioned in Portable Ops, that's realistically the best we can hope for when it comes to these PSP titles. To introduce brand new, innovative gameplay mechanics would be a revolution that, while not being impossible, I don't imagine would have been a priority either. Our continued pursuit for the nukes eventually takes us to a boss fight against a tank, and the second boss fight in a row that can be fought in essentially the exact same way as the first. The biggest compliment I can give to these two are that they function perfectly fine. Everything else surrounding that is just so dreadfully mundane. The additional enemies helping alongside one of these bosses might have been okay if it only happened once, but bringing that idea back for the next fight confirms these two are both following the very overdone and derivative idea of amplifying the difficulty of a boss without the boss itself causing that. It's admittedly one of my biggest grievances when it comes to boss fights in any games. There's very few which are constructed in this sort of way that I still think can be defined as great. The one-on-one aspect of a boss fight not only creates the feeling of a showdown, a feeling that I think should arguably be captured for most boss fights, but having multiple subsidiary threats pretty much has nothing to do with the boss itself. They're just something else that get in the way of you taking down the boss, and more often than not, create a feel of artificial difficulty. You'd be able to beat the boss itself, if not for the extra enemies. The boss doesn't present a great enough challenge, so instead of balancing the boss out so that it does, these extra enemies are placed alongside it for a sort of quick fix, one that almost never feels satisfying to me. It's like if in Dark Souls, FromSoft realised how easy Pinwheel is, and made the whole fight about eliminating a number of highly resistant guards protecting Pinwheel. Yeah, it'd make the fight more difficult, but for me, it'd feel incredibly cheap. It's kind of like what we see with the Bed of Chaos in that game, a boss fight that can literally be taken out in one hit, lying behind one of the worst concepts for a boss in FromSoft's entire catalogue. So in terms of the T-72, I'll reinstate, it's not really a bad boss per se, it's just one that brings pretty much nothing new to the table, except the artillery it's shooting out, those being the missiles it fires compared to the Lav G's bullets. This boss is so derivative that it's not just the idea of fighting a slow moving vehicle that has enemies helping out alongside it. it, as looking to the back of the tank, we're able to see the two bright red fuel tanks again, which upon destroying them causes the exact same effect we saw on the Lav G. Make no mistake, these two bosses would fit right into a certain game series that I perceive to be far lesser, but this is Metal Gear we're talking about. This is a series that is oftentimes defined by its iconic villains and fantastic boss fights, and so far, both of those things appear to be missing in Peace Walker. There's no real antagonist to attach to as of right now, aside from the overarching CIA threat, and these first two bosses only reinforce that feeling even more. We're not fighting anything as charismatic as Revolver Ocelot, or as mechanically deep as The End. We've got two boss fights in a row now that appear near identical and are bland as anything. The best thing I can take away from this fight are the destructive elements that accompany the tank's more devastating firepower, being able to topple over the several carriages lying around the rail yard, working well as a visual, as well as keeping the player on their toes, and perhaps encouraging a more stealthy approach on a subsequent playthrough. That is really about it though. Up next is another mission where we have to backtrack and blow up a barricade. The reuse of these areas starting to become even more apparent at this point, but still switching things up slightly by gradually introducing more of the enemies wearing helmets. I really like that element of the game, and it's one that we haven't particularly experienced all that much in the Metal Gear series at this point. It does a great deal to negate the player's reliance on certain weapons like the tranquilizer, as even by introducing something as simple as a helmet that pops off after only one shot, it gives the enemy the time to either get out of the way and still remain a present threat, and also gives them the opportunity to spot you and activate the alert phase. Although I will say right now that despite functioning essentially the exact same as what we've seen since MGS2, the alert system is arguably the least challenging it's been up to this point. We're now at the stage where Snake can take so much incoming damage and can hold so many healing items that dying becomes something that's much less likely to happen. The alert itself is noticeably less severe, which I have to presume once again comes from the technology, with there being significantly fewer guards getting thrown at us, presumably to reduce the performance impact. But it's all the other elements of the game that only make the alert seem even easier. With the aiming system being so easy to use now, you're able to take out enemies in a far more effective manner. With the progression system the Mother Base presents and the additional resources we can acquire from the side ops, we're also able to gain access to incredibly useful and more lethal weaponry very early into the game. The stealth element is still there, and when taken advantage of, can still be very satisfying in terms of gameplay. But I've got to say, the repercussions are almost entirely gone. It started in MGS3, got worse in MGS4, and pretty much disappears here. It only makes sense for the series to evolve as time goes on, but I didn't think it'd be in relation to the stealth aspect that still defines this series. The mission that follows this, however, does vary things up quite a bit, with some of the locations we travel to being pretty unique for the series in general. I'll admit, the transition is very similar to what we see in MGS3, coming out of the jungle environments to a far more grey, rocky landscape. We first get a bridge that presents the idea of verticality once again, featuring two layers with enemies on both. The number of guards wearing helmets starting to increase even further, and with them being packed tightly together, you might have to come up with some alternate strategies aside from merely shooting to avoid causing a ruckus. Past this point, we get an area reminiscent of the mountain ranges in MGS3, having this escalating terrain, with the terrain itself and the many objects and vehicles serving as cover for both you and the enemy. And past that, we get what appears to be some kind of broken down fort that stands in the way of the base we're aiming to get to. The architecture of this small fort in particular standing out very strongly compared to many other areas we've seen in the past, that while still being considerably small and not all that intricate in terms of its design, still looks great in my opinion. And reaching the inside of the base, we're given one of my favourite interactive cutscenes throughout the game, this being a moment where we're not forced to perform QTEs or getting some dumb Easter egg where you can see beneath someone's clothing, but instead are given the chance to look in several different trucks, many of which hide some fantastic little secrets.
Metal Gear.
Now this is what I hoped these interactive elements would be used for. Yes, it's dumb, and yes, it doesn't really make any sense, but who cares? This game is in no way taking itself seriously for the most part, so I see no issue with including stuff like this. And not to mention, unlike the crappy QTEs that might actually turn players off the idea of returning to certain missions, these moments will only really increase replay value, as if you perhaps only witness one of these secrets and then find the correct truck immediately after. You'll start questioning what lies in the rest of the trucks and play the mission over again.
Sunlight!
Thankfully, when finding the correct truck and discovering the cargo's already been taken, we start getting the first real hints of unique familiar characters, and also the idea of an antagonist. Overhearing a conversation between two men, Hawk Coldman and Huey, with Huey turning out to be Otocon's father, who we last saw in MGS3 posing with Granim for a photo. Huey, however, has had the exact same treatment as Snake, sounding and looking pretty much identical to Otacon, but not really making as much sense, due to there not being that same clone idea in relation to the two characters. The conversation conversation we hear them have is the first one in the game that had any real weight or impact for me, coming back to the argument of using nuclear weapons as a deterrent, but having Huey and Coldman disagreeing about how they should go about reinforcing them as a deterrent to the world.
First, you must have nuclear weapons. Second, you must never use them first. And third, and most important, if someone attacks you, you must strike back. Unless we prove beyond a doubt that these three principles work in practice, the world will not accept our new deterrent. And the only way to do that is to show them we're capable of actually launching a nuke.
But isn't deterrence supposed to stop nukes from being used?
Exactly. And so the one we launch will be the last one ever.
With conflict being a facet of humanity that seems like it will never truly disappear, simply hoping for peace isn't going to cut it, with Coldman wanting to make a power statement to all the nations around the world, not by launching an offensive nuke on any of them, but instead showing off how they're capable of launching one to begin with. Coldman takes the view that for nuclear weapons to be taken seriously as a deterrent, they can't merely claim they've got them, they have to prove and actively show off how devastating their nukes actually are. Huey disagrees with this view, however, it's not one of those black and white things, even despite how Coldman is very clearly being painted out as the evil one here. There's an argument to be said that conflict could still come knocking at America's door if they don't preemptively show what would come as a result of that conflict.
Unless we prove we're capable of launching, Peace Walker is useless as a deterrent.
As I said, these are things that will always happen. There will always be extremists in the world, and nations that disagree with each other. Coleman aims to strike fear into the heart of all nations around the world, a grand statement that tells everyone to not mess with the USA. However, his view is also rather short-sighted. He hasn't thought about the possibility of other nations following suit, and trying to level the playing field by showcasing their nuclear weapons too. Coleman thinks the nuke launched by America would be the be and end all, but I'm not sure about that. You get the feeling that tensions could only rise from a nuke being tested in this way, possibly leading one nation to the point where they go to an extreme and try to launch a nuclear weapon on someone else. Neither are the ideal outcome. Not proving their strength could lead to America being seen as weak and inferior to other countries who might show off their nuclear weapons, whereas showcasing their weapons could lead down a path of escalating chaos. Leading on from this, we come face to face with the Peace Walker machine, seeing it be taken away by the other flying machine, with Snake promptly being attacked by yet another machine, this one being referred to as Pupa, in which we now have to take a step back and realise what we're witnessing right now. A behemoth machine known as Peace Walker, a massive flying vessel, and now a large, fast and dangerous AI attack craft.
Take him out!
When is this game set again? I'm sorry, but none of this adds up. It's one of the big side effects from the massive focus Kojima takes towards Big Boss's adventures pre-Metal Gear 1. And as it's shoved right in your face most of the time, it's something that fans have obviously called out as being completely nonsensical in terms of the series' overall story. This only gets worse when coming into MGS 5, but it's clear to see by the massive technological advancements we're seeing that Kojima's lack of interest in series continuity is at an all-time high. We got a taste of it in MGS 3 with the Shagohod, showing off a machine that, while not even being referred to as a Metal Gear, easily supersedes the likes of Metal Gear Rex and Metal Gear D. And in that instance, you could make the argument of different machine, different outcome. Even with the technological jump, the innovation of the Metal Gears may have merely been too much to achieve effectively at the time, bearing in mind the arguments I'm making here are not backed up by the actual games whatsoever, but we'll make the exception. This, however, falls apart immediately when looking at Peace Walker, being presented with machines that are defined as Metal Gears, and are all infinitely more functional than anything we've ever seen before. This isn't a case of technology trying something innovative in the past, failing, and then being refined. We've got a Metal Gear that flies in the air, which works perfectly, the Pupa, which is just as intimidating as something like Rex, while being so much faster in terms of its speed and how it deals out attacks. But luckily in this game, it is predominantly in relation to the Metal Gears where this is a problem, but as we'll see in 5, it eventually reaches the point where Big Boss starts using technology that's far more advanced compared to things we even saw in MGS 4. It all makes absolutely no sense, and Kojima doesn't appear to care whatsoever. It looks like at this point, he's now going for spectacle over continuity, and it does make sense why. If he doesn't really want to make these games anymore, and wants to leave the story of Solid Snake alone, he hasn't really got much of a choice. He can either pare things back and receive criticisms of these new entries not living up to previous ones, or go all out and forget what this stuff means at large. I don't personally have a big problem with it per se. Once again, Peace Walker kind of gets away with it because of how over the top and goofy a lot of the elements already are, but it does undeniably start to make me look look at the series in a slightly different way. It's not a matter of the series being convoluted anymore, although those criticisms are still valid. It's a matter of it not even being cohesive, not quite making sense. And for a series that started off with both interesting themes as well as a great literal story, it's now only the themes that appear to matter. Coming to our boss fight with the pupa, however, our approach is pretty much identical to the previous boss fights, that being to deal as much damage as we possibly can. Despite that, however, the pupa is a big step up, both in terms of the threat and sheer spectacle. The scale of this thing is what you'll notice immediately. It feels massive in comparison to you, and I'd argue that's something most of the Metal Gear fights in this game achieve really effectively. Soon after though, it'll be the pupa's mobility that could get you even more rattled, moving at an incredibly fast pace around the curved arena, presenting a brilliant sense of disorientation as it goes round and round before eventually launching itself at you. The momentum is something they really get right here. The speed it gains never feels contrived, and as a result, almost always feels like when I got hit by this thing, it was my fault. I also think it makes the pupa look fantastic, as it launches itself right to the top of the arena, before cascading down at a very high pace. That's really where the best part of the fight lies, how we deal with the sheer speed and size of this Goliath. But it does also feature some more standard attacks, like electric and bullet-based ones, that are fairly easy to avoid. For a game that oftentimes appears to pare down scenarios, the pupa is outright bombastic, creating set-piece worthy moments, like when we have to quickly lie flat on the floor and let it pass over us, or when it raises up one of its arms and charges towards us before slamming onto the ground. It's all really great stuff. This isn't just a good boss in comparison to the last ones, this is a good boss in general. Despite being another machine, it's even made a lot less lifeless by having the pupa be controlled by the AI that we see mounted on the top, this being the thing that keeps letting out that strange song we've been hearing. As you would have been seeing from our attacks, it's also the first boss that introduces the idea of multiple different parts, all of which get damaged depending on where our shots land on the pupa's body. However, this will be a more important factor later on, so overall, this is some really good stuff all round. The fight against the pupa never lets us take a break, being consistently engaging and genuinely dangerous throughout. We are still ultimately pumping round after round, missile after missile into this thing, and at some point, I would have liked to see perhaps some more creativity in terms of the tactics we have to implement, but the spectacle itself and the high octane nature of the fight do negate those criticisms quite substantially. And with the pupa destroyed, the AI ends up escaping, where we then have a brief talk with Huey, discussing the other unmanned weapons we've been seeing, as well as the conception of the Peace Walker project.
We used this facility to develop unmanned weapons.
Unmanned?
Robots. The one you just fought was a pupa. There's also a flying type called Chrysalis, and a treaded type, the cocoon.
Kojima's deliberation on that act of nuclear warfare being just as interesting as always, highlighting the strange reality we find ourselves in, where the closest thing to peace that can be achieved at this point in time has the possible consequence of complete world catastrophe. There's an unwritten agreement across all the nations in the world that hold nuclear weapons, that in the event a nuke gets fired at another nation, retaliation is inevitable.
Put simply, nuclear deterrence is the idea of using nukes to keep nukes in check. If one side launches nuclear weapons, the other is sure to launch theirs in retaliation, which makes launching an act of suicide. In the end, neither side can use its nukes. It's thanks to this doctrine that the world's two superpowers have avoided all-out confrontation. Nuclear deterrence has brought us peace. At the very least, it's prevented another world war from breaking out.
It's that fact, as well as merely having the nuke itself, that gets everyone on the same page to a certain degree. The most powerful nations are essentially no longer able to spark a third world war. The potential for someone to launch one or several of their nukes as a way to win would be too great, and the retaliation would leave the world in shambles. So that brings an interesting argument in terms of people who advocate for the complete eradication of nuclear weapons, as once you understand the cause and effect nature of the whole situation, there's reason to believe the world would actually be worse off. Remember, the deterrent is inherently based on the complete elimination of the world and everyone on it. And the way these nuclear weapons are handled won't merely be the case of a president or prime minister pushing the big red button. There'd be checks after checks, votes after votes, confirmation after confirmation from large groups of people. Regardless of who's defined as being the head figure of a nation, they will not be allowed to make those decisions by themselves, pure and simple. That already is slightly more reassuring, especially in the case that a nation with nuclear weapons has a leader that appears to be maniacal or unpredictable in some way. But say we do wipe out every nuclear weapon across the world, you've then got a problem with how people now deal with warfare. We'd be brought back to a point where gunfire and artillery are the predominant ways to wage warfare, and with the right set of circumstances matching up, a third world war would be far more likely. So there's arguments back and forth, and it's something that still gets debated to this day. The irony of peace lying behind the most destructive weapons on planet Earth. An impactful thing to think about. And with the additional factors Huey starts bringing up about it not being certain that a country would retaliate in regards to a nuke striking their nation, it deepens the subject even further. Peace Walker being the byproduct of a lack of reliance on human involvement in relation to these things.
With Peace Walker, retaliation is certain. It chooses the appropriate target and launches a retaliatory nuclear strike every time, without needing human input to make the call. Launching a nuclear strike against Peace Walker is tantamount to pushing the launch button against yourself. It closes the loophole in nuclear deterrence theory, rendering our friends in Country X completely unable to launch.
Peace Walker itself is a message to all nations around the world that if they attempt to launch a strike on them, there's not a single chance of a retaliatory strike being impeded.
I believe in peace through nuclear deterrence.
Why?
My father worked on the Manhattan Project. He put his whole life into that research. And all it created was this illusion of peace called deterrence.
With Huey telling us we should go find a woman called Dr. Strangelove, obviously being a reference to the Stanley Kubrick film all focused around the atomic bomb, we get a fantastic clarification on the meaning behind the Outer Heaven name when inviting Huey back to Mother Base.
So what will you do now?
I'm done with science. At this rate, I'm probably already halfway to hell anyway.
Not so fast. Why not join us? Our place is Outer Heaven. You'd fit right in.
Outer Heaven?
Other fans may have already guessed the meaning of the name from the name alone, but this confirms that Big Boss's personal view of what he's trying to achieve isn't clean cut. He's very aware that many won't look at him as being on the right side of history, and we can see that's definitely the case when looking at the actual Outer Heaven during Metal Gear 1. The people he's recruiting, the operations he's signing his army up for. Some may be better than others, but none of them are outright admirable. With the recruitment of Huey and the gradual expansion of Mother Base that we can see when coming back to it, I start getting this ominous, dark feeling creeping over me. Snake hasn't really done anything that out of line as of right now, but knowing where he'll end up, the warning signs now appear to be shoved directly in our face, making our actions feel equally as wrong. Just to listen to the music that plays when coming back to Mother Base, and how it progresses the further you get into the game and the bigger it gets. Already ominous to begin with, but by the time you're reaching the end stages of the game, it's like we're truly witnessing the transition from Snake to Big Boss, not just how it was alluded to in 3 and Portable Ops. Considering we're back in our Mother Base, I think we should also acknowledge a nice little side mode that was added in Peace Walker that introduces the idea of passive, non-playable missions that further boost your progression. These are referred to as the Outer Ops, giving you several teams that you can assign soldiers in, and letting you send them out to the battlefield, the rewards varying depending on how difficult the mission is. This is yet another addition that makes the staff system seem even more impressive, and fills in the gap nicely that was left absent in Portable Ops. As you may have noticed, we're quite firmly put back into the shoes of Snake again, with all of the main missions forcing you to play as him the first time round. This being a change that I actually think fits a lot better, due to my feeling that in Portable Ops I found myself becoming a bit too detached from Snake during the gameplay. However, we are allowed to use other members assigned to the combat unit upon completing the mission once, and also for all the side ops, a sort of in-between from the comrade system we saw in Portable Ops, but not being anywhere near as impactful. What seems like the biggest difference are the stat changes now, which to be honest are all quite irrelevant in my opinion anyway. Snake has high enough stats to get you through every mission fairly comfortably, so if they were to just remove the comrade system outright, it wouldn't have been a huge issue, but still something that feels missing, even when comparing it to the fairly inferior Portable Ops. The Outer Ops, however, puts all our soldiers in the combat unit to good use. Nothing that can be raved about too much, due to the majority of this stuff being passive, as I said, but still utilising certain mechanics to their full potential. We are able to get an idea on how the operation went down when coming back to Mother Base later on, but due to it being conveyed in a pretty lackluster fashion, I don't see this capturing most players' imaginations for too long. long. Still, another facet of the game for players to get involved in, and a part of the game that both has pretty nice gameplay connotations, with how building up our army and arsenal of weaponry becomes more important when being faced with the harder outer ops. And also narratively, with how this facet of the game alone shows how the MSF are sending troops and artillery all around the world, building connections and gaining even more power. With all the talk in relation to the somewhat scary prospect of what the MSF might start becoming, nothing quite defines that more than what Snake and Kaz end up taking on after a conversation with Huey.
By the way, if you're at all interested in improving your tech, by all means assign me to the R&D section. I'm pretty sure I'll be of some use. Once we have the necessary materials and blueprints, we can start work on that bipedal mech.
That's right, we're at a stage where it's in Big Boss's best interest to develop a Metal Gear of his own. What he once wanted to be a nomad group who stays on the move is now starting to form into something very similar to the nations he was initially opposed to.
One more thing. Our new bipedal weapon needs a name.
Good point. We can't keep calling it our bipedal weapon.
I had a talk with Miller and we came up with Metal Gear Zeke.
Metal Gear? Zeke?
Yep.
The Americans have their nukes, other nations want theirs. The Americans have their Metal Gear, Big Boss wants his own. Just pay attention to the way Snake interacts with Huey here, especially when being reminded of how he took out the pupa.
If anyone could do it, you can, boss. You single-handedly took out the pupa.
True.
Outside of their stoicism, there's one thing that's always permeated for both Solid Snake and Big Boss, that being absolute modesty. Neither of these two ever look at their accomplishments as anything else except a part of completing their mission. And not just that, both characters also look at their actions in the cold light of day, seeing the oftentimes harsh, violent actions they're taking for what they really are. But that sentiment applies to most of their actions too. Neither of them ever appear to show any real satisfaction in what they're doing. They see their mission as a means to create a better world. In this moment for me, we start to hear how Big Boss is actually buying into his own hype, perceiving himself as the legend so many other people see him as. He doesn't ignore the almost sycophantic attitude coming from Huey. He acknowledges it, appreciates it, and it seems to boost his ego. This is just one example, but this is something we see reinforced so much more throughout these last two games. The main point being the legend status of Big Boss, and how once again, Big Boss himself buys into it, and in turn, feels almost obligated to take certain actions he wouldn't have before. From this point, there's really no going back. For all the games where we've directly fought against Metal Gears, seeing them as nothing more than a weapon of mass destruction, we're now creating one ourselves, with this mech going under the name Metal Gear Zeke. And outside of the twisted plot implications, this component of the game, while not being all that fleshed out, is actually really fun. It all links to those parts I was talking about when fighting the pupa, with all of the AI bosses featuring individual parts and AI modules that we can take for ourselves. All of this is RNG based essentially. There's no real way to acquire the exact parts you want when fighting these things. Although what it does present, which most players will only be paying attention to during the endgame, is the additional layer of accuracy we're having to now apply during these fights. Because as we saw, if we're aiming to acquire a certain part, we naturally can't cause a significant amount of damage to it. Nothing too deep, but I still found the acquiring of the Zeke parts pretty fun. I'd argue mostly because it gives me a chance to experience the bosses once again, and test out some different approaches. With Mother Base now being in full swing, we enter Chapter 2, The Phantom Hero, with our next mission taking us to some brand new jungle environments that I think look equally good compared to what we've already been seeing. We also see some fantastic enemy placement that utilises the jungle really well as their enemies' camouflage. We're warned of this at the start, and to be honest, it makes me wonder why we've never seen more of these sorts of things in the series, especially in MGS3. I kind of understand it from a realism perspective. Enemies aren't going to be constantly waiting for a threat they don't even know to be there in the first place. But having these heavily camouflaged enemies lying in wait behind trees and rocks can really catch you off guard at points. I found a lot of these to be genuinely well hidden, with their camouflage working really effectively, making it even more rewarding when I found them by paying extra close attention to my surroundings. And ultimately, that's my favourite part, as visually, everything really is almost identical. But hey, it is a jungle, I can't complain that much. The terrain varies things up enough to where none of these environments could ever be thought of as boring or stale, so turning our attention to more obscure enemy placement seems just about right at this point in the game. One thing you would have seen me doing with all these enemies so far, however, is one of the most integral parts of the game that I haven't mentioned up till now, and that of course is the brand new Fulton recovery system, allowing us to knock out enemies, connect them to a balloon, and launch them back to Mother Base. Now, as we already know, this idea was originally conceived in Portable Ops. However, in that game, despite being a great concept, it was just far too tedious to ever be truly satisfying. What should have been a mechanic that incentivized players to build up their army and go into missions players wanting to extract enemies was brought down so heavily because of how we had to drag them back to one single van at the start of the level. And not just that, we had to do them one by one. Peace Walker, on the other hand, observes the potential that system presented, and with the far more expanded version of the staff system we saw in Portable Ops, obviously knew that if they were encouraging players to build up a genuinely sizable army this time round, it'd be ridiculous for them to go about the extraction system in the exact same way. So as a result, we get the Fulton system, an incredibly quick fire method to send enemies right back to your base. There are a couple factors that may perturb a certain kind of player, however, and inherently, there's another aspect of the game that could be seen as being somewhat nullified due to the very strong presence of the extraction system in this game. Firstly, it's hardly ever the case in this game where Fultoning is mandatory, but I'd be lying if I didn't say it helps out immensely. Remember, after a certain point, we do get volunteers making their way to Mother Base, so you can gain recruits that way. However, starting off, you're ideally going to be wanting to level up your weapons and equipment as fast as you can, but there is going to be some players who just aren't interested, and will suffer the repercussions because of that. They're no longer able to play this game in the same way they've played all the other Metal Gears. And yes, I suppose you could say they just need to adapt, but while the mechanic is good and works really well, it doesn't change up the gameplay fundamentally enough to where I think that's required. The gameplay is very similar in every way imaginable. The only difference is the extraction mechanic making a number go up in your Mother Base. The other aspect I feel the extraction system gets in the way of is the extensive arsenal we have in this game once again. Now in a game like MGS4, the vast amount of weapons we had access to most definitely got in the way of the stealth gameplay, but it's hard to say that game was ever really aiming to be a full-on stealth experience anyway. In MGS4's case, there were weapons that were much better compared to others, and there were also several more unique weapons as well. However, the main impression I got from that system was experimentation. You could very well use the M14 the whole way through. It's one of the most accurate and lethal weapons in the game by far. But as there's such a wide variety of options to choose from, it's almost begging you to switch things up and try out some new ones. The R&D system we get in this game, while not being as expansive, is far superior to the Drebin Point system in my opinion. However, the big issue this time round is that unlike MGS4, which hardly gave you any punishment for using either lethal or non-lethal weaponry, going lethal in Peace Walker is now heavily discouraged because of the extraction system. The majority of these weapons are still lethal, so despite having a wider arsenal compared to all other Metal Gear games bar MGS4, I end up feeling even more restricted, mostly using lethal weapons either during boss fights or when I can't lose the enemy. And even if it might be related to the anti-violence message of the Metal Gear series, it's never been pushed this heavily, and in terms of the dissent we see from Big Boss in this game, it doesn't match up there either. Again, you aren't forced to use non-lethal weaponry, however, the benefits are just so in your face that it's very hard not to now. So while the extraction system reaches what I perceive as near perfection in terms of the mechanic itself, while still being very goofy, like being able to fall on someone through a ceiling, there's other factors that it does affect in a rather negative way, and that shouldn't be ignored. It's not a matter of what most people are going to be doing, it's a matter of elements of this game that have been implemented that are now somewhat suffering because of other elements. We proceed through yet another area filled with hidden guards waiting for your presence, until we're greeted with a boss fight. And wouldn't you know, it's another vehicle, albeit this time a flying one with guards assisting it. Our fight against the Hind, while being genuinely quite impressive, due to this being one of the first boss fights with a flying target, that doesn't require a lock-on system to feel satisfying. We're getting into a pattern now that's starting to become slightly tiresome. We've got another boss fight against another lifeless machine, with the additional enemies still feeling like they're supplementing what would actually be a pretty easy boss on its own. Anyways, this boss plays out about as you'd expect. The enemies on the ground run after you and try to kill you, and the Hind itself requires bullet after bullet, missile after missile until you win. There is the additional flying element, which stands out as one of the best parts of this boss fight, flying around and giving you a harder time to land a clean shot off, as well as perhaps throwing some players off due to the target coming in from a different perspective than we're usually accustomed to. Its attacks are exactly what you'd expect, bullets and missiles getting fired down. But again, I'm really just not impressed whatsoever. As you might have noticed, Peace Walker once again models its boss fights in the vein of MGS4. Your ammunition and healing items become one of the only things that stand in the way of you defeating these bosses. No skill is really present at all, but aside from putting your crosshair on the target and firing. Gone are the satisfying hits that wipe out a large amount of the boss's health. Gone are the creative strategies that can be implemented. The first time you come up against these vehicle bosses, with weaponry that likely won't be the best, these fights feel so drawn out. Each segment of the vehicle's health bar takes such a significant amount of damage to be removed that it's what I describe as almost the exact opposite of satisfying. It feels like an absolute slog, a damage sponge. I'll say again, these aren't criticisms of the Hind specifically. Out of all 3 vehicle fights so far, I'd actually rank the Hind at the top. It's more the strong similarities that are shared between all these fights that make the flaws even more obvious. On its own, I guess I could have given the first fight against the Lav G a pass, presenting us with the idea of boss fights in general before becoming more elaborate and creative. But being given 2 other boss fights now that so closely resemble that first one, as I said, it feels tiresome and only exposes even more issues with these fights the more their structure is repeated. Look, we've seen much worse, but we've also seen much better. While a fight like the Pupil was more interesting due to its design, both in a stylistic and gameplay sense, all of these bosses are still lacking any real weight. There's no reinforcement of an overarching threat that could potentially elevate these fights. Continuing on, we make our way through even more areas with camouflaged enemies lurking around, which I will say doesn't feel repetitive. Despite this being the main threat for 2 missions in a row, it actually turned my attention back to stealth at its purest form, not merely running forward and trying to get the best shot off on someone. The enemies in ghillie suits I find to be particularly fantastic, but that's also because of a benefit that Peace Walker has, which other Metal Gears have never really gotten to experience on this level. We've always had backtracking, however, what past games tried to do when going back to areas we've already been to is switch up things like enemy placement to throw off the player. Now, in the case of Peace Walker, you still have enemy placements being changed depending on where we come in from, but you've also got to consider that along with the side ops, that predominantly puts us in areas we've already been to in the main missions, as well as the main missions themselves that feature backtracking. We're given a greater opportunity to take all this stuff in and learn how all these different areas function. Naturally, this will occur for anyone who plays any game enough times, but I find Peace Walker manages to pull it off in the first playthrough. In my personal opinion, by returning to these areas in different contexts, it makes all these areas and the enemy placements within these areas stick out very strongly, giving the benefit of additional knowledge when coming back to them in the future, but also just a straight up benefit for the game as a whole. I'd say only up until the very late stages does returning to certain areas start to feel a bit stale, but in that case, I'd argue that's primarily because of the context. It shouldn't be underestimated. I think parts of Peace Walker feature some of the most tightly designed areas we've seen in the whole series. It's not a surprise that with the mission-based structure and less amount of areas and details overall compared to previous games, we see these areas get reused, but reused in a way that feels beneficial to the experience, not detrimental. Snake ends up discovering a French woman who's got no bottoms on, because of course she doesn't, turning out to be the woman who recorded the voice of the boss on the tape we saw at the start.
I don't know. There was a tube. A large tube in the back. When I approached it, I heard a voice.
What did it say?
Jack. Yes, it simply said Jack, over and over.
Jack.
We end up taking her back to base, and upon making our way outside the lab, which I'll say has a wonderfully unique ruins design that both looks great and plays great, the ID card we were given by Huey ends up not working.
What? It won't open.
We then get a slightly more unique mission when being told to go find a guy with an orange jacket, who apparently has a working ID card on him.
The soldier with the ID card is wearing an orange jacket and is in a location where you'll hear Quetzal singing. Find that soldier, retrieve that card.
That's another part of this game that I perceive as rather detrimental, to be honest. No passes are going to be given to a supposed mainline Metal Gear member, and what's currently on offer with this game in terms of objectives is just pretty underwhelming, to be honest. It feels like a combination of the plot and the mission structure. There feels like an overall lack of direction to me, because if we break it down, excluding the boss fights, we've only had missions where we're sneaking around and making our way forward. And on the surface, that might sound like that's what we've always done with these games, but it really isn't. There's always been strong plot implications that reinforce the gameplay. Just look at MGS2 for example. Arguably the longest gameplay section in that game was the bomb disposal part. There was a set goal of deactivating these bombs, and upon doing that we go up against Fat Man. Or what about MGS1 on the run up to the Sniper Wolf fight? You can just say we're heading up and down the same areas we've already been, but it's once again the plot that makes the gameplay section as a whole a lot more impactful. There's genuine stakes, something which feels missing in Peace Walker. And that's ultimately aside from the point. What I'm talking about here is what we're actually doing while spending our time with these games. There has to be some form of variety in between these sneaking sections that keeps things fresh. Video games work off that all the time. Gears of War, which I brought up earlier, is a great example of that. You shoot, and then have a story moment, or the environment significantly changes, or you get a driving sequence. And with Metal Gear, the boss fights were debatably the main thing which brought variety in my opinion. The formula was the stealth, with more creative, explosive fights being interspersed in between. In Peace Walker though, we can't really have that, as most of the boss boss fights here even feel like they've become too formulaic. But that's not it, as we can't just ignore the unique gameplay segments outside of the boss fights in past games. What about the cell sequences in MGS 1 and 3? The temperature-based keycard, the scientist disguise. I know we haven't yet experienced everything Peace Walker has to offer at this point, but for me, it's already relying too much on its core gameplay. And look, games can do that. There's many games that have a solid fundamental base that doesn't really get differed from. But this is Metal Gear we're talking about, one of the best franchises in gaming history. On the same note, however, I can also clarify this is Peace Walker we're talking about. While the gameplay is pretty great, especially for what was originally a PSP game, we cannot ignore the fact that it's nowhere near as deep. Enemies are easier to deal with, most areas require less observation and careful navigation, and the number of creative strategies we have to implement are very low. You could understand if MGS 2 or 3 relies more on the core fundamentals, because in their cases, there were already so many detailed nuances to them. The core gameplay was something that would just keep on giving. Very soon after starting Peace Walker, I'd already felt like I knew how this game worked, as I'd already experienced most of what I had to offer before. A similar example would be when we look at FromSoft's games, and how they've evolved quite substantially without getting any real credit for it. Dark Souls 1 is a very measured game when looking back to it. You're really made to take your time with most of the encounters presented in front of you, and a lot of the combat ultimately came down to realizing when your enemy's striking, dodging, and then getting some hits off yourself. Both of those aspects varying depending on what you're fighting and what weapon you're using. Fast forward to Dark Souls 3, and it feels like a completely different experience. It seems like ever since Bloodborne, the way their games function have changed quite substantially, as the pace of the combat has only seemed to get faster and faster. You can't approach Dark Souls 3 in the same manner you approached 1. Things have been altered so substantially, while still retaining the core elements that made up the first one. And in Peace Walker, we have those core elements, but are somewhat lacking that innovation that we've seen across all the mainline games. Whereas every sequel has appeared to innovate in certain departments, and perhaps go in a different direction in regards to others, Peace Walker, at least on the gameplay side of things, somewhat stagnates. It's familiar to the point of feeling done. Coming back to the mission in question, however, what initially seems like a more unique mission actually ends up being rather simplistic upon going into it. The setup is interesting, telling us that we'll need to be finding a certain guard with a bird chirping nearby. That should have been it, in my opinion. That is a perfect setup for a mission where we go back through areas we've just been. As I said, learning more about how these areas work and where the enemies are hiding when coming in from the other entrance, and then searching for the guard in the area with the Quetzal. What essentially ruins it, however, is that they end up putting the guy who's got the ID card in a bright orange jacket. Why? That one decision ruins the whole concept. 1, it's supposed to be a search. Why give such an obvious clue when we're already being given the indication we're in the right area by the Quetzal? 2, it's an absolute wasted opportunity to really take advantage of the interrogation system, either questioning the other guards in a process of elimination, or perhaps even having them guide you directly to the guard in question. And finally, it doesn't even make any sense. You've got all these guys dressed up in camouflage, and then one absolute melon in bright orange for whatever reason. I hate to see that kind of stuff. The mission had great potential to have players using their own instincts. The Quetzal idea is great as well.
Yes, that is definitely the Quetzal.
It perfectly indicates you're in the right area. At that point, it should have just been a gradual process of questioning all the guards until you find the right one. It really isn't the most outlandish concept we've seen in the series. I've got no idea why you really needed the jacket. And that's what I mean about lacking these unique gameplay segments, as what could have been one in this instance is absolutely ruined. You're doing the same thing as you did before, but now need to take out a specific guard. It's not really all that different to some of the side ops, but believe me, we'll be getting into that far more in MGS 5. Anyways, making our way inside Strangelove's lab, but we're greeted by her immediately. Her design being distinct due to the red jacket she's wearing, but her accent being that same weird, fake-sounding English one we hear from Liquid in the earlier games. Once again, due to it being done by an American actress.
Don't move. You men and your guns. You all say the same thing.
It's not impossible for Americans to do a good British accent, but Jesus, they are bad in Metal Gear. Strangelove proves herself to be a particularly strange character from their very first meeting, appearing to have a strong admiration of the boss, goading Snake to kill her and taunting him. There's some great moments in what she talks about that truly makes you start looking at Snake in a different light.
You chose a shadowy country over the mentor who made you what you are. You brought despair to good soldiers everywhere. You used the pretext of a mission to kill a true hero.
Let's not forget, everything she mentions here is actually true, but it appears Strangelove isn't aware of the specifics in this situation. Snake did choose his country and his mission over the boss. It was not only the sole way of preventing a nuclear war, but was also something that he was being instructed to do by the boss. Even when she defected and was seen as being against him, the boss was still essentially guiding Snake, and telling him that no matter what, his mission has to come first for the sake of humanity. The interesting part is that Snake plays into her narrative. Even though he's got very little to prove by this point, and almost nothing in terms of upholding the standards of America, he still refrains from giving her the full story.
She betrayed America. She stole a Davy Crockett and then defected to the other side. She used an American nuclear weapon to attack Soviet territory. The only way for Washington to prove its innocence to Moscow was to eliminate the traitor themselves. The boss's death was the only thing that could have prevented all-out nuclear war.
Is that what you call the truth?
It's the truth as it was told to me.
Heading inside, we're then introduced to the boss herself, her voice now being revealed to be coming from that AI pod that inhabited the pupa. Strangelove programmed what she calls this mammal pod to take on the personality of the boss, a personality which she and Coleman believes would be perfect for the Peace Walker mech. Snake once again lets his emotions get the better of him when the AI calls out to him, getting locked inside the pod and being taken to a short but brilliant gameplay segment that functionally is identical to when we were last in the AI pod. What makes this moment great, however, are the external elements surrounding it. Ultimately, we are just pulling out the circuit boards again, and with the time limit we've got, we know we won't be able to take out all of them. But it's the way that we appear entirely surrounded by the boss's voice, on top of the increasingly disorientating visual effects that start getting thrown on screen, that makes everything a whole lot more bizarre.
I'm not your boss anymore. Go home. You better stay alive from now on.
We don't really know anything about how this AI has been programmed, but judging from Strangelove's reaction, it seems like if the layered voices and reactions are something that's coming from the pod itself, not just in Snake's mind, it's appearing to have a far more visceral and extreme reaction to Snake than she's seen before.
What is this? This response? Oh god. Discontinue!
Following on from this, Snake appears to pass out, with his mind subconsciously taking him back to his final interaction with the boss. The new art style presenting a different perspective that I think looks brilliant. And while I could have done without the QTEs, there is still something I really enjoy about seeing a scene from a previous game be presented in this brand new context. Arguably, for a series that links to past events so much, I would have perhaps liked to see a bit more of this. Bear in mind, we've always had links back to past games before, and even had scenes from these previous games directly shown in their sequels. But what I'm referring to is kind of like if a scene from MGS1 was recreated in the engine of MGS4, more than likely being a lot more effort and a lot more costly in that case, but still a cool idea regardless. And awaking on the outside, we're taken directly into a fight against the Chrysalis. We're looking at this second encounter against the AI pod. I think we're presented with an even greater disparity between the other boss fights we've seen so far. This disparity, as you may have guessed, coming from how great this fight is. With us now having two flying bosses in a row, you may feel like it could be slightly repetitive once again, but the Chrysalis is a whole different story to the hind. Unlike in that fight, a rocket launcher with a lock-on function is almost required, as despite being a much bigger target, the Chrysalis launches itself much higher into the air, covers a much larger amount of the area, and has incredibly fast movement. I never thought I'd be witnessing a spectacle from this game, but boy, does this boss defy those expectations. From the unique arena featuring these Aztecian ruins, the fog which eventually envelops the area, and the sheer size of the Chrysalis itself, I find this fight to still look visually outstanding. Our process of elimination is identical to the pupa, where we can either aim for the individual parts of the mech to acquire the AI parts at the end, or aim directly for the pod if we want to get a part for Metal Gear Zeke. However, for a boss that looks like such an intimidating foe, the way it goes about taking us out is slightly underwhelming, but I totally understand why. Using FromSoft as an example once again, you tend to find in those games that despite their immense difficulty, it always seems to be the case that the bosses which are much bigger in size are usually a lot easier to deal with. This, I imagine, primarily comes down to the surface area. Bigger enemies move slower, giving you an easier time to dodge and get hits off, but they cover more ground and usually have attacks that are much more devastating. I say usually, as that's not always the case with FromSoft. A game like Shadow Shadow of the Colossus is another example of that in my opinion. The bosses in that game are nothing short of jaw-dropping, but ultimately, I wouldn't say I really had a hard time taking any of them down, because once again, the very big ones move slow as molasses. The Chrysalis is slightly different, in that it's big, moves fast, and is able to use the environment to negate damage. However, as a result of this stuff, which I do genuinely find to all be positive, the one place where it stumbles in my opinion is its attacks. The bullets it fires down not only deal such a small amount of damage, but the accuracy is also all over the place. Out of everything it shoots down, you're going to be getting hit with about 1 or 2 bullets, so long as you're just moving around. The additional drones it shoots out are great, a far better external threat compared to the enemies that have continually shown up during the vehicle boss fights, fitting tonally with the fight, as well as presenting a different kind of threat that we need to acquaint ourselves with, as opposed to the enemies on the ground who function the exact same way they always do. But ultimately, your offensive and defensive strategies are about the same as they've been for every boss fight so far, so basically get those hits off and run around. While I think the Pupa is still the more intense and engaging out of the 2 AI boss fights so far, the Chrysalis excels in the visual department to an immense degree. The pod itself makes another escape, with Snake pursuing it and finding himself in a quarry, the environment being switched up once more by taking us out of the ruins and placing us into a sun-soaked rocky landscape. Now in terms of how the level's designed, I can't really say all that much, as it eventually turns out this quarry map literally only pertains to 2 locations, those being the stealth-based one we're exploring right now, and one which holds the next boss fight up ahead. We once again see a very densely packed environment with multiple guards wandering around, the highlight of this miner's residence in particular being the ladders we can climb up, introducing the verticality element even more strongly compared to what we saw in the jungle. But as the gameplay is just so similar in this area, the main takeaway was without a doubt the visuals, where despite only being contained to one area, the art direction feels strong enough to where this area sticks in my head. It both feels like it fits into the sections that came before it, while simultaneously presenting something new. The new stuff in this case being the warm sunset, as I already said. But you've also got all the unique structures, featuring rusty roofs, small shacks, and stacks of wood lying around. There isn't that much to praise admittedly, as there's so little to experience. But let's just say there's only positives that come from areas like this. And that goes for the boss fight that follows on from this too. The arena in this case being absolutely massive, but accompanying the sheer size of the boss really well. We first take out a certain number of enemies in one sole mission, which feels a bit unnecessary to be honest, before then going up against the cocoon. Now, ignoring the fact that this is a machine that's said to have been developed before Metal Gear Rex and Ray, this is one intimidating mech, and unlike some of the previous bosses, the size arguably matches up quite well with the actual threat this time. The cocoon is basically one giant automated fortress. Its attacks don't persist of having one railgun be shot at you, or a couple missiles. This thing isn't playing around, activating several miniguns, missiles, and turrets from all over its body at the same time. Despite being more spaced out, and not being as up close with this boss, it arguably ends up feeling the most frenetic due to how it goes about taking you down. Aside from perhaps the rather inaccurate bullets once again, it doesn't feel like it's holding back whatsoever. From the very start, it feels like it's throwing absolutely everything it can at you, and with the area being so open with hardly any cover, you'll find yourself frantically scrambling around at points trying to figure out the best plan of action. As you've heard, the attacks from this boss are just as varied as all the other AI fights, but it's not just that, they're all incredibly devastating this time round as well. Even when wearing uniforms like the battle dress, the missiles it shoots out of its front barrel cause an absolutely devastating amount of damage, making survival a real priority for one of the first times in the game. Missiles are still the way to go with this fight from our position, and luckily, despite appearances, the amount of damage it can take doesn't actually feel that different to what we experienced in the last couple fights, even though it would make perfect sense for such a gargantuan foe to be a lot more resistant compared to the more lightweight Pupa and Chrysalis. In a gameplay sense, I've personally never liked the feeling of whittling down a boss's health bit by bit. I mean, you could have already gathered that from what I prefer about the boss fights in MGS 1 and 2, but it's more the idea of a boss that just feels like it's being dragged out for no real reason. Yes, we should feel totally inferior to the cocoon starting off, as it makes our ultimate triumph over it feel even more impactful, but to feel totally powerless, it just leads the fight to feel like it's going on for too long, and that our weapons aren't doing anything. And talking about the elimination of this thing, we finally get a different kind of ending to a boss fight. It is all still based around taking it out with our weapons, but as we draw towards the end of the fight, a ladder drops down from the cocoon, in which we then have to climb up its body and reach the AI AI pod on the top. It feels like there's some real Shadow of the Colossus inspiration coming from this fight, with scale being pretty much the biggest takeaway overall. I don't just enjoy the final ascent to the AI pod for the sake of it though. It's another aspect of the fight that's pushing us out of our comfort zone, and forcing us into dangerous positions. Hey, I'm not ashamed to admit that the way I went about taking this thing down did feel very cheesy, making my way up to the top of the quarry and using a slim piece of cover to negate quite a large amount of the incoming attacks. But it feels like something else the devs had already thought about, with not only the final part of this fight forcing me to move from this position and potentially risk dying in the process, but also from the guided missile attack it performs quite frequently, this being one of the only attacks that'll almost definitely hit you even if you are in cover. And finally, what's even better about the climb up is that even during this moment, we're still not being given a break. The turrets and miniguns that were shooting us previously now turn around and shoot us even more while on the cocoon itself. We're literally not given a chance to rest at a single point during this fight. So yeah, the cocoon is absolutely brilliant. It's now abundantly clear they were more than capable of creating some fantastic bosses, despite the more limited hardware they were working with. Which, as I said when talking about the chrysalis, makes the other vehicle bosses stand out even more, making them look very much like padding before we get brought to the real boss fights. Before we head inside the nearby base, I think it's time we properly discuss the inclusion of the side ops in this game, and what the idea of side missions introduces to a series that typically focuses solely on the main plot. Now, let's make it clear right away, from the first few side ops we're given at the start of the game, the side part makes itself very clear even when just looking at the titles of some of these. Target practice, Phantom recovery, target demolition, eliminate the enemy soldiers. If it sounds like these could have been VR missions, it's because that's essentially all they are. They're exactly what they say on the tin. You're told to eliminate the soldiers, you eliminate the soldiers. The major benefit, of course, comes from the impact these have on your mother base, and how they work when putting them back in the context of a handheld game. By including these side ops, I see Peace Walker as the only handheld Metal Gear that covers literally all bases. You've got your main missions that present new areas, cutscenes, and boss fights, and then you've got the side ops, where gameplay's segmented into even more bite-sized chunks. However, whereas some people might be slightly disappointed due to the vast majority of these basically being the same thing, rinse and repeat, I don't have an issue whatsoever. It comes back to the PSP again. This is a console that, in my personal experience, I have very rarely been able to get totally engrossed in. It's the same kind of mentality when it comes to watching films on a mobile phone. Someone like David Lynch might think of it as tarnishing the quality of the film.
Get real.
But in my opinion, if you personally are able to get the same level of enjoyment while watching it in that way, I don't see any issue with it. I don't think just because something's presented on a smaller screen that it inherently takes away from the experience. Different people are going to react in different ways. Just talking from my personal perspective, however, I am someone who finds it difficult to connect with things that aren't right in my face. I think it's why certain people gravitate to formats like vinyl, and continue to purchase physical media like games and films, outside of the whole not technically owning it thing when buying digitally. Subconsciously, but I think you're more willing to engage and get invested with what's being shown, because of the effort it takes to put the entertainment on. Putting on a vinyl, for example, you first need the record. If you don't have one, you go out and buy one, or wait for one to come via a delivery. Then when you have it, you put it on the record player, and if you want to play a specific song, you have to closely inspect the grooves and then place the needle on the right one. Point being that all of this takes a lot more time and effort compared to, say, tapping what song you want to play on Spotify. In putting the vinyl on the record player, you've shown that you're willing to engage with the music in a certain kind of way, and are more inclined to pay attention to it because of that. Not everyone will think and act that way, but I think it's a fairly rational assumption to make. And tying this back to the difference between home consoles and handhelds, if the intention of the handheld was to be somewhat similar to how mobile gaming is now, a 10 minutes of fun mentality, the side ops fits perfectly into that model. No deep plot threads you're having to pay attention to, no cutscenes that go on for too long. These get straight to the point. Kill these enemies and you're done. Extract these, you win. Beat the boss, well done. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad we've got both of these approaches. Despite feeling like it fits the medium better, I would be a lot more disappointed if Peace Walker turned out to be an experience that persisted of only side ops type missions. And although I've perhaps made them sound slightly banal, there are definitely some gems to be found as you get further towards the end of the game. And it's here where Peace Walker, in my view, ends up becoming debatably the silliest Metal Gear game in the series. And that's genuinely some feat. Bear in mind, when silliness happened in previous games, it always either fit the atmosphere of the main story, or was being presented in some of the alternate side modes. But whereas in those cases, where you only had a handful of these moments, Peace Walker just goes all out in some of these. Main ones that come to mind are things like the Puyan missions, where we have to shoot the balloons connected to the flowing soldiers, giving us the goofiest music imaginable in the back. You've also got the Monster Hunter crossover. with several fights against all kinds of creatures. And how could we forget our date with Paz, being equally hilarious and creepy at the same time. Overall, I'm more than satisfied with these side ops. They're integrated into the whole experience so much better compared to the VR missions that came before it. The more you do, the more noticeable their impact will be on your mother base. These actively feed into the main game now, instead of just being a bit of wacky fun. And even though a large amount of these fall into the same kind of pattern, there's without a doubt enough variety to actively encourage the player to go through all these. As bear in mind, paired up with how the gameplay works in this game, you'll not only find these fun to complete on their own, but also in a rather rapid fashion too. Heading into the hangar, we end up being taken to one of the very few close quarter sections in the whole game. This area given the feel of the more industrial atmosphere we saw in MGS1, while the several mechs we see in this place give shades of Arsenal gear. Again, we're gonna have to just ignore what appears to be these mass-produced mechs, as it makes no sense for these to be here considering the time period. This is yet another part which is just okay. Outside of those mechs, there's not really anything all that interesting in terms of the visuals, and unlike the areas out in the jungle or in the ruins, the level design relies much more on pure claustrophobia. Not in the densely packed weaving designs with enemies hiding in camouflage, but in a way that feels far more restrictive, presenting passages that send you down a set number of routes, patches of open space with hardly any cover, and a bit more confusion when it comes to our way forward, due to there being several different platforms and several different ladders, all leading to different parts of the hangar. Nothing to get hung up on, of course, but also nothing substantial to praise, especially when comparing it to past areas. What should be praised, however, is the underground passage we make our way to after the hangar, featuring a two-layered design with multiple enemies patrolling on the top and bottom, where as you can see, it's the density that once again comes to the forefront, with the area being packed with all kinds of crates, pillars, and metal barriers that we can use to make our way forward sneakily. My favourite part of condensing these environments being how certain level design choices can be observed at their core. In the jungle areas, for example, the layouts can sometimes be so weaving and jam-packed with all different kinds of routes and blockades, whereas here, you've got the upper and lower levels with one destination at the end, with both layers having what could be described as a two-lane structure, either heading down the right or left path. And although that may sound a tad more simplistic, which it very much is, that's not an issue for me at all. Not only is it presenting a higher degree of variety, as not many areas before this have shared that similar structure, but as I said, paring everything down in this way actually makes me appreciate the design even more when observing the core fundamentals of the stealth gameplay. Finally reaching the AI pod, Snake talks with the AI version of the boss again, still not seeming to grasp the concept of what's actually going on here. Bearing in mind when this game's set, it's actually not a surprise that Snake isn't sure whether or not he's talking to the actual boss. Not only have we not seen him come into contact with anything even close to this kind of talking AI system, but even if he were aware of how these AIs functioned, it appears that his emotional connection to the boss herself is overriding any clear thought at this point. It's during this interaction, however, where the effect seemingly starts wearing off, with Snake trying to get some closure and understand the boss's mindset more in her final mission, only for her to have no knowledge about it whatsoever.
Do you have regrets?
Regrets?
About your final mission?
My final mission?
The one in Groznygrad.
I've never been on a mission there.
It appears that despite Strangelove's claims that she used as much information about the boss she could possibly acquire, it seems the Snake Eater operation has been entirely omitted from the AI's knowledge. It's not that it isn't willing to give up the information, it doesn't have any record of it. No Groznygrad, no defection, no final mission. Snake ends up getting discovered, having a confrontation with Coldman, who gives a short recap of his plans with the Peace Walker mech. The most interesting part of this being how the whole concept of this automated nuclear deterrence actually relates to the real-life Cuban Missile Crisis in a major way.
Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the commander of a Russian sub refused an order to launch a nuclear-armed torpedo at an American destroyer? In retrospect, that man was a hero. He saved the world from all-out nuclear war. Humans are incapable of destroying themselves.
But an AI wouldn't hesitate to push the button.
This is genuinely true, and is a pretty amazing story of how one man stopped a nuclear torpedo being launched by opposing his other two allies. This single example sums up the sheer danger of nuclear weapons, as well as how this uninformed AI might not actually be the best candidate to be the one in control of them. If not for Arkapov's resilience, the Soviets would have actually ended up firing this torpedo for no reason, purely due to their own speculation that a war had broken out and they merely weren't being made aware because of how they were unable to contact Moscow. And that's where everything comes back to the AI once again. Because it's been programmed in a particular way, there's no room for those kinds of thoughts, and no room for any decisions to not be agreed upon unanimously. Although in theory it would seem like Peace Walker and the AI pod would be the perfect deterrent, that's only because it's been designed to only view events in one single way, when it's just not as simple as that. Coleman says that men make mistakes, but machines don't. But what about the conversation we just had with the AI a second ago? That was even worse than a mistake. That was total ignorance, a complete gap of knowledge. Of course, however, the key thing to realise is that out of all the people to be defying the CIA's plans, and putting a stop to the AI pod, Big Boss is the most hilariously hypocritical figure to be doing it. He's been trying to put a stop to all these AI-controlled mechs, while simultaneously creating a Metal Gear of his own, made out of the broken parts and AI boards of the mechs he's destroyed. It's less of a liberation, but more a transferal of power. This is everything that Big Boss was trying to avoid at the start of the game. This is what comes with setting up shop and establishing themselves in this kind of way. Their army of nomads now has a set home. They're now fighting for something outside of the initial objective. With Snake getting captured, Strangelove ties us up and prepares to torture us, her intention being to get the final few bits of information about the Snake Eater operation, so the boss's AI is fully complete. And as you could imagine, when it comes to any kind of torture sequence in the Metal Gear series, we're not just watching it play out, but we're also having to actively spam the action button to keep Snake alive during these moments. And yeah, it's got the same effect as always. You reach the end of the interrogation a bit worn out, just like Snake. But this staple is one that feels like it's getting a bit tired for me. Every time it's happened before, but it felt like it had a set unique purpose. The interrogation during MGS1 was the very first time we saw this happen. That idea was then translated to MGS2, the effect in that case all being tied into the intentionality of how similar the game already was to the first one. Then fast forwarding to MGS4, we never actually get the interrogation sequence, but still a torture sequence in its own right when it comes to the microwave, still having to mash the action button to succeed. In my opinion, not only were those instances set up slightly better, with much higher and more varied stakes, but unlike Peace Walker, they all brought something new to the table. This is just a torture sequence, pure and simple. There's nothing behind this which carries the same emotional punch of the microwave sequence, or the bizarre deja vu of Arsenal gear. On top of that as well, this is hands down the most annoying torture sequence out of all of them. Initially, I thought this was only a problem when I was a kid, as coming back to it this time round, I was actually able to pull it off in my first attempt. But searching up online, my thoughts were confirmed, with people giving advice like using a spoon, locking their frame rates when playing on emulators. And for a sequence that has no real depth whatsoever, outside of pressing a single button, that's just ridiculous to me. And by the end of all that, Snake manages to keep his lips sealed, bringing us to a short gameplay segment that takes the form of our classic cell escape sequences. And although this one doesn't have as many options of escaping, I do still really enjoy the manner in which we get out of here. It all revolves around the massive scar that's now shown on Snake's torso, where what initially appears to merely be some kind of ode to the boss, instead turns out to be a secret hiding place for a jigsaw Snake's hidden inside, where upon discovering it, we can soar into either of the two doors that are connected to our cell. My favourite part coming from the patrolling guards and how we're able to observe them. Bear in mind, although both previous cell sequences had a lot more options in terms of our escape, they also lacked a certain level of tension that you ideally want when performing this kind of escapade. If you go under the bed in MGS1, the guard just opens the door and tries to kill you. The escape is opened quite literally straight away. In MGS3, we even had the option to input a specific frequency that just straight up opened the door. Don't get me wrong, I'd still say I prefer these ones compared to Peace Walkers, purely from a variety standpoint, but the feeling of slowly cutting our way through the iron bars, while being given the ability to look back and forth to see if there's any guards incoming, is fantastically intense. And with the instant fail state we're given when getting caught while trying to escape, there's a lot more risk to be found here too. Before, we realistically could run around acting as strange as possible, with the only consequence being the guard's acknowledgement of these weird actions. Peace Walker, on the other hand, tells you to try again, which some people might not like, but ultimately for me is a better consequence compared to having the guards stupidly open up your cell and giving you an even easier chance of escaping. And upon getting out of our cell, we've also got the additional element of having to stay out of sight as much as we can, as all of our gear has obviously been taken away from us. Although with how the hand-to-hand combat has been majorly simplified this time round, and Snake still being pretty durable, you could end up in a situation like I had, where you just go around throwing all the enemies into walls without having much trouble. The next mission has us going back through the underground passages, the structure of the missions at this point seeming to be even more regimented than I initially thought. Not particularly an issue, more just an observation. The way all the main ops have played out includes a first mission where we're exploring a map for the first time, a second mission where we have to go back through areas we just explored, usually culminating in a third mission that's either a boss fight or the run-up to a boss fight. I don't have a problem with that kind of thing personally, but having a strict structure is most definitely better than having no structure at all. But I could very much see certain players perhaps getting a bit sick sick of it around this point, as unlike games like MGS 3 and 4, we're always going back to the same areas at one point or another. In no way has Peace Walker presented the continual ongoing discoveries and adventure that we saw from those games. We eventually find the hangar where Peace Walker's being kept, with Coldman finally showing his hand and proving himself to be an outright villain once and for all.
I'll let you in on a little secret, Big Boss. You see, I've already selected Peace Walker's initial target. An offshore area in the Caribbean. The trade winds will scatter the fallout all over the surrounding region. Crops and fish will die, leaving plenty of free hands to help us mass produce Peace Walker.
Before, it seemed like there was some valid reasoning behind his idea of showing off their deterrent to stop anyone striking them, but now he just seems outright maniacal, targeting Mother Base as the nuke's point of impact, and explaining that he plans to mass produce the Peace Walker mech, using the workers who are affected by the nuclear fallout. Peace Walker no longer seems like a deterrent. It now looks like just another piece of machinery that's being created as a way to win this power struggle that made up the Cold War. Another way for America to prove their dominance as the most powerful nation in the world.
Don't you see, Snake? We need nukes, controlled nukes, to have peace.
Lies!
Peace Walker will restore order. Order in the form of a new Cold War. But if the world is to understand the genius of our plan, we must launch!
This takes us to a fight against Peace Walker itself, this mech being one that presents the towering scale that we witnessed from the Cocoon, while also being a lot more mobile, with slightly more variation in terms of its attacks. Out of all the mechs we faced so far, I think visually, this is the most Metal Gear looking one we've gone up against. It's something that I've noticed when looking back at all of the machines of the previous games. There's been some damn impressive designs, but the ones that stick out to me more than anything else are Rex and Ray. Now, you could argue that's got something to do with me just having a stronger attachment to those games, but I also think their designs are inherently more memorable due to one big factor, and that's the anthropomorphic nature of them. Rex and Ray have always stood out more to me because of elements like their heads, the animalistic sounds they make, and especially in the case of Ray, the upright stance it sometimes takes. It's those kinds of things that usually subconsciously make these foes a more personal threat, solely because of that human connection, at least for me. Something like the Shagohod or the Pupa may look impressive, but they feel a lot more lifeless. They look like a machine and only a machine, a hollow tomb that carries out functions. It's kind of like what I remember from the enemies in Batman Arkham Knight, a great game that I still really enjoy, but one that undeniably had a much bigger emphasis on the Batmobile and the countless unmanned vehicles you had to fight. In comparison to our fights against humans, it just felt like it was lacking something. These robots weren't actually fighting for any cause, they had no interest in what they're fighting for. They were doing it because they were programmed to. Coming back to Peace Walker, however, this design does re-establish that more human connection, where not only do we have the return of the talking AI pod, but also the spherical ball on the front of the mech that looks like its head. As for the boss itself, however, you should already assume by this point that there's not all that much to go into outside of these rather surface level observations. Missiles are still the way to go, the arena is identical to that of the Cocoon, and the only thing which varies the boss up slightly is the boss's own attacks. These are pretty great, however, starting off with a flamethrower that it can activate when we get too close, and also a stomp that, for some insane reason, we can actually parry, with Snake literally holding Peace Walker up and moving it away. And as we draw closer to the end, Peace Walker starts freaking out, running around the arena while letting flames out everywhere. A manic visual and pretty effective attack to boot. But ultimately, we have done this all before by this point, and the additional creativity we saw from having to climb up the Cocoon during the last boss fight is unfortunately missing as well. Thinking about it, it's in this game made for the far less powerful PSP, where we've consistently gone up against some of the biggest and most devastating mechs we've seen in the series. And despite that, I still feel underwhelmed. It's a key example of how bigger isn't always better. On the PSP, this would have definitely presented a wow factor, and even in the HD collection, all these bosses look great as well. They stack up nicely alongside pretty much all the other mechs we've seen in the past. But again, we're literally just talking about visuals here. On the surface, you'd look at the fight we have with Peace Walker in comparison to, say, our fight with Vamp, and I don't think it'd be stupid at all to make the assumption that Peace Walker would be the better fight of the two. There's an assumption being made that because of how stunning the fight looks, that this would hopefully translate to how the fight actually plays. But to anyone familiar with game design in the slightest, you know that these two aren't really linked. Yeah, Vamp's arena might not be that impressive visually, but somehow the frenetic energy that's created due to how Vamp has been programmed makes the fight overall feel significantly more intense compared to the vast majority of boss fights we've seen in Peace Walker. Just because we've got a big boss and a big arena doesn't mean we're going to have big stakes or high risk, and that's something I could really feel in a lot of these fights, and especially Peace Walker because of the higher rank of equipment I was carrying. Once you get these highly ranked launchers and damage reducing uniforms, these fights end up hurting even more, but I understand that kind of thing is a double-edged sword that some people will like and others won't. In my opinion, I think to make a boss fight truly well made and truly satisfying, it always has to present a certain degree of challenge, regardless of difficulty. Now that might sound counterintuitive. You might think, how could you have a boss be challenging but not difficult? But when taking a look at a boss like the End from MGS3, it should make a bit more sense. As I mentioned when talking about that fight in the MGS3 section, I initially never understood the praise that fight got, because I was associating good design with difficulty. But when observing the fight outside of how easy it can be to finish it, you start seeing where the challenges lie. Things like observing our environment, tracking the End down, how we can effectively use our movement to sneak up behind him. And while you may say these factor into what would be described as the difficulty of the fight in some way or another, I think I look at difficulty in perhaps a more objective manner. Elements like how long it takes to complete a fight, how much damage the enemy gives out, and how much damage they can take. That's where the difference between difficulty and challenge presents itself. While you might not find it that difficult to track the End down, the challenge is still there to be overcome. And with the boss fights in Peace Walker, you've oftentimes only got difficulty, and the challenges that are presented are ones we've had to deal with time and time again. Not just in this game, but across many others. How effective is our weapon? How much damage are we taking from the boss? Where's an effective weak point? All things that are very common. They wouldn't stand out this much if it wasn't for these being part of the Metal Gear series. But as they are part of it, I'll say again, it just feels quite underwhelming. It's not that these bosses are merely very similar in how they function, or that there's no real creative ways of tackling them. It's also that there's no adaptation that's required from us as a player that feels even more damaging. Even the fights in previous games that may have all been focused around damaging a single target, they all had unique attacks, different phases, that swung the fight in a totally different direction. The fight against the Harrier where the arena gets obliterated, the knife vamp throws down that stops us from moving, the several different phases during the Grey Fox fight, the many different hiding spots of Laughing Octopus. I've said it once and I'll say it again, there's nothing like that here, not at all. You might even feel like I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but I want to make it clear that as a huge Metal Gear fan, I feel that appearances are very much deceiving when it comes to Peace Walker's bosses. That's not to say they're bad, but in perhaps an even worse scenario for some people, they're mostly just bland, forgettable. If not for the brilliant visuals, there wouldn't be many things that draw me back to these fights, as they're just so similar and don't have a core structure that I find to be that original or interesting. So, with all that being said, the Peace Walker fight is alright, but nothing we haven't already seen. After defeating it, it turns out that we're being presented with one of those fights where winning actually means we've lost, with Peace Walker being just as functional as it was before being hit with about 30 missiles in a row, and making its escape, where we're then made to chase after it by spamming the action button, being utterly ridiculous and quite annoying, but still being made up for in a big way when it comes to the amazing artistry from Ashley Wood, which as you would have been seeing, has remained consistently brilliant from start to finish. The way these cutscenes are presented somehow excel past the already excellent ones we saw in Portable Ops. And talking of Portable Ops, there's something else that was brought over from that game and expanded quite significantly, despite not particularly being that necessary. Those being the online features, ones that now have a sole focus on cooperative gameplay, allowing you to complete particular missions alongside fellow teammates, as long as the mission itself says you're able to. However, there's not much I can really say about this, as not only was the last time I was able to properly experience all these things around 10 plus years ago now, but from what I remember, the co-op itself was just about as you'd expect. A pretty goofy addition that brought your friends into the fold, heading into a mission with multiple snakes, all sneaking their way, or more than likely blasting their way to the end of the mission. It's an interesting concept in theory. Co-op based stealth can be something that works really effectively, as I felt was the case with games like Splinter Cell Conviction. But whereas in that game's case, you had an entirely unique campaign that's solely built around the co-op component, Peace Walkers just feels like a fun idea that somebody thought up that I'd be able to use the PSP's ad hoc and online components. That ad hoc being a cool feature of the PSP from what I remember, despite perhaps being a bit finicky. But yeah, Peace Walker is the only Metal Gear that we get to experience with friends in this kind of capacity, so I am glad in some sense this was done here instead of never at all. But equally, I wouldn't say there's anything online-wise that's presented in this game that players will be clambering for again. I feel like if you're not creating a completely separate online section with all kinds of different game modes and the like, it's gonna have to feel necessary to the main experience, and I'm just not sure that's the case with this game. We already proved when playing the game on single player that everything can be done with one person. The additional teammates might be fun and might be helpful, but they don't really need to be there. Well, unless you're having a really hard time with the game or something, and as we've already seen, Peace Walker isn't what I'd call the hardest game in the series. Pursuing Coleman and the AI pod, we find ourselves at a US missile base in Nicaragua. The map we've got to explore in this location, once again featuring a very limited number of areas, before we're then brought to the next boss fight. I think there's a steady trend as we make our way towards the latter parts of this game, where the story's taking a far larger priority. Compared to the initial jungle and ruin sections, these recent maps have a lot less areas to explore. They all still look great, but as we saw with areas like the miner's residence in the quarry, it's not uncommon for us to get through one area and then have the mission immediately complete. And that'd be fine if they were merely condensing all the elements that we were experiencing before into one smaller, more tightly designed patch of gameplay. But I just don't think that's the case, especially when it comes to the sneaking sections in this missile base. Emphasis on the sneaking part of that, as there's quite a few moments throughout this base where being detected and engaging in combat are unavoidable. Starting with this opening area, however, there's some things that I like and some things that I think perhaps falter, especially in comparison to areas we've seen earlier in the game. The look of the guards in this area presents yet another switch up, where at this point we have to realise that aside from MGS4 once again, the amount of variety when it comes to the character models in this game is fantastic. No more of the exact same masked enemies we see get repeated across the entirety of MGS2 and 3. Peace Walker not only gives us guards with all kinds of different uniforms, but also in the case of the enemies we've seen wearing helmets, an actual gameplay acknowledgement of what they're wearing. Might sound like one would inevitably come with the other, but you'd be very surprised. That goes for the enemies we discover in this area as well, having total head protection, and once again leaving us in a position where if we want to take them out using our weapons, we either risk pulling off a double headshot before the enemy runs away, or either tranquilizing or shooting them to the body instead. This area to me felt a lot more linear, but I felt like there weren't as many alternate routes for me to take. Enemy placements were a lot more obvious. Still fun to journey through of course, but not on the same level as the jungle or ruins which I just mentioned. Aside from the verticality that's presented in this area, which I always find gives the player a more difficult time straight away, we also get a new enemy type, kind of, as we end up facing those same mini drones that we saw during the Chrysalis fight, but this time in a stealth context. Functionally, they're quite similar to the Cyphers from MGS2, but I do like the additional surprise they introduce in this area specifically, having a patrol route through this tight sewer part, where you need to either think quickly and move out their way, or try and take them out. Their detection range thankfully being made a lot more obvious from the bright red beam that shoots out their front, something I've always felt is far more important to integrate into the design of these robotic enemies, due to us not having any real concept on how far and how well they can see in comparison to your average soldier. The maintenance dock area we explore after this does get a bit more ambitious, featuring different levels we can make our way up and down, as well as having the area almost divided into two sides. And past that, the rooftop we make our way to, while looking the best visually, with how we're given a greater view of our industrial surroundings, as well as the several smokestacks we see rising in the distance, is about the same gameplay wise, mainly being focused on verticality, and the new drones that patrol these areas. And as you might have expected, it turns out when reaching our goal that the structure's been repeated yet again, with the initial mission mainly showing off gameplay, the second having us go back through the areas we've just explored, and the third culminating in a boss fight. However, we definitely can't write off the backtracking mission this time round, as here it's not just a case of sneaking back through the areas we've just explored. As we see from the cutscene, the context is actually a bit different, with Snake being discovered, and thus having us be thrown straight into an alert phase from the second we enter the mission. And this ends up persisting for the stage as a whole, with the enemies always knowing of your whereabouts, and leading the experience to feel like an all-out firefight, which, surprisingly, I actually really enjoyed. Bear in mind, unless you personally have been playing in this aggressive manner in prior missions, this is the first real time outside of boss fights where we're actively being encouraged to go hell for leather. Extraction has finally been put on the back burner, despite still being possible. This is a mission all based on taking out enemies and making our way forward as fast as we can. The design of the new areas aren't really anything to be truly marvelled over, as can be seen in the main maintenance dock, which is literally just a straight path forward. But I do love some of the destruction we see here, being able to take down the bridges above us by shooting the explosive barrels on them. The grandiosity and explosiveness is genuinely impressive in these moments, and that's somehow amped up even more when making our way to the heliport, getting one of the very few more telegraphed gameplay sections we see across the game, which is actually quite surprising considering how much they're utilised in past games. And what I'm referring to in that sense is that not only can we not progress to the finish until we take out all the enemies in the area, but also how the musical track Heaven's Divide starts up as the gunship makes its way onto the scene. It's just some all-out action, delivered in a really fantastic way. Of course, there's nowhere near as much depth when it comes comes to the action set pieces in the Metal Gear series, in comparison to the stealth, but that's why presentation matters. As I said before, there's a possibility that certain players would have already been playing in this loud, aggressive manner, during stages that weren't even forcing this approach on you. But the difference here is that the escalation feels a lot more substantial and in your face. Unlike in the missions before, the alert doesn't just die out upon killing a certain number of enemies. This time, we're being shot at by gunships, having windows smashed in, using turrets to fight back, and being hounded by significantly more enemies all at once. And when it comes to the music, not only do I think it sounds great, it also perfectly matches the intensity of the scene. It gives what might appear on the surface as a normal offensive encounter a lot more weight. Perfect for what's essentially the penultimate sequence for the first part of the endgame. Getting inside the control tower, it gets revealed that Galvez has actually been working behind the scenes all this time, his real name being Vladimir Zadornov. His mission now being to launch a nuke on Cuba and pin the attack on the Americans, something we can't allow to happen. But as it seems Snake has finally met his match, being outnumbered and outgunned, Kaz and our MSF allies come to the rescue. A pretty epic moment, but one that once again has rather sinister implications when thinking about the future, especially when everyone starts chanting Big Boss's name, a reminder of where all this will eventually lead. As it seems like our mission's about to be complete, however, Coleman manages to activate Peace Walker, taking us to our final fight against it, one that I find to be a bit more impressive compared to our first encounter. Now of course, we know how we're going to be taking this thing down, so what exactly is it that's changed in this fight for me to think the exact same boss has improved? Well, for starters, the arena. While I don't think it actually looks that great, with the rather grey skies and pretty underwhelming environment mainly made up of warehouses, fences and cranes, it is new at the very least, not an exact repeat like we saw in the quarry. I don't think it looks terrible of course, there are redeeming factors, like the slight sunlight that we can see peeking through the overwhelming clouds, and also the addition of the ocean on one side of the arena, which Peace Walker actually uses from time to time to begin another launch sequence. And I think that is the main thing which elevates this fight compared to our last encounter with it. Throughout the fight, Peace Walker is continually trying to launch a nuke, in which we're given 60 seconds, genuinely quite a short amount of time, to try and stop it. The way we stop it, well, is the same as usual, which can be slightly annoying if you find yourself lacking in terms of ammo. If the launch sequence starts and you have to throw down a supply marker, for example, by the time you get the supplies, you're going to have a razor thin amount of time to throw Peace Walker off balance, something that may not be achievable in some cases. So it's not perfect, but still, the addition of this time-based element that gets repeated several times throughout the fight not only introduces higher stakes, with this fight possibly being the key difference between an all-out nuclear war, but gameplay-wise, there's finally something else to focus on outside of just pumping sheer lead into a machine. It still revolves around that obviously, but the additional urgency that's brought to our actions can sometimes feel really tense, especially because of the amount of shots this thing can take before it gets knocked off balance, as well as how short the time frame we're given is. Peace Walker's attacks also get expanded and made even more lethal in this fight. The flamethrower, for example, covers a much wider range, while seeming to track your movements a lot more closely. We also have to deal with way more ranged attacks, a component of the first fight that was strangely lacking. Things like rockets, balls of energy, and my personal favourite, the drill missiles. Missiles which dig themselves into the ground and track your position, with constant movement being the only way to avoid them. All of these are being added on top of most of the attacks we saw in the first fight, with the leg motor charge covering a massive amount of ground in a really short amount of time, making it a pretty hard attack to get out of the way of. And we also see attacks coming from multiple unexpected angles, like from the water and behind some of the warehouses, as Peace Walker oftentimes tries to crush us before going into another launch sequence. Overall, a pretty great fight. Outside of perhaps the pupa, the high octane energy and explosive nature of this fight makes it damn engaging throughout. Yeah, it's not all that different to our last fight against it, but let's just say with the added attacks, frequent countdowns, and more cramped arena, it feels like we're always one step away from getting crushed by this beast. Unlike we saw in fights like the Cocoon, there's so many attacks that get thrown out by this thing where we can hardly stay still for even a second, whether it be the drill missiles, rockets, or the laser that can freeze Snake in place. There's always something to be looking out for, but always something that keeps us on the move and totally invested. And can I just say as well, despite not being as catchy as many of the other boss themes in the past, the music that plays during this fight, and also the music that accompanies all the other boss fights, is just as high quality as you'd expect. Music is of course a very subjective thing. I just tend to lean more towards the synth-based electronic sounds in the first two games. But if you enjoy the more epic orchestral sounds we saw in MGS 3 and 4, Peace Walker has definitely got you covered in that regard. The cutscene which follows gives a rather optimistic message that entirely echoes the real-life Soviet submarine story that was mentioned earlier, with the Pentagon being given a fake alert that nukes are headed towards the US, in which Snake has to talk them out of firing nukes of their own.
Mr. Chairman, I'll get straight to the point. Cancel the retaliatory strike now!
What?
The radar blips you're seeing are all fakes. No one's launched any nukes.
How do you know?
The launch data is fake, part of an experiment that leaked. You weren't supposed to receive it. Your radar is showing missiles that don't exist.
Their acceptance of Snake's story somewhat confirming Coleman's belief that humans are incapable of carrying out something as severe as launching a nuke onto another nation, while at the same time giving us yet another example of how esteemed Big Boss has become in the eyes of the American government. If it wasn't for him, these guys would have literally fired a nuke already for no real reason. They went off Big Boss's word alone. The AI pod eventually opens up by itself, in which we're taken to an even more bizarre sequence, where we once again are made to remove the circuit boards to shut it down. However, this time, we also have what appears to be these holographic, or perhaps entirely illusory butterflies gliding around. The butterfly symbolism being something that, as you would have seen, has persisted for a large amount of the game already, specifically in the mechs. Pupa, chrysalis, cocoon, and now butterflies inside Peace Walker. However, looking back to MGS 3, we also see this emphasis on the butterfly at points, like when Snake tries to grab one in the cave. The intention of it back then was rather unclear to me. However, I'd have to assume with the message of evolution that's given out from the different mechs the AI pod controls, as well as the further clarification and outright deferrals when it comes to the ideologies and ideals characters like Big Boss now hold. I personally see the butterfly as both a symbol of peace, and exactly what I said a second ago, evolution, in relation to many facets. The key one in my opinion occurring within Big Boss himself, because as we'll see when reaching the final stages of this game, Peace Walker doesn't beat around the bush when it comes to Snake transitioning into a villain. Anyways, the moment inside the pod is great once again. Some real Space Odyssey vibes in this one, with how the AI gradually starts regressing as we pull more and more of the boards out. All culminating in a final, rather awkward mission where we blow Peace Walker to smithereens, stopping the fake nukes being sent to the Pentagon's radar system, and having the AI drag itself into the water in some kind of knowingly selfless act. My favourite part during all of this once again coming from the more bizarre elements that I do wish were perhaps amped up slightly more in this game, to coincide with the continual mental torment Big Boss appears to suffer when confronting his final battle with the boss. The boss's will appears to be shown off in all its glory when it comes to the AI pod drowning itself. Strangelove seemingly managed to capture the one-of-a-kind heroic mentality the boss held, and with that, it's almost like her sacrifice at the end of MGS 3 is repeated all over again, but now in a completely different form.
And still, all you can do is sing. There's no peace to be found anywhere. And so, we can only keep on hoping. Hoping for the illusion we call peace.
However, what seems like a pretty quaint way to end the game, with all the characters now clearly understanding the boss's choices during the Snake Eater operation, and giving what's essentially her spirit the chance to redeem herself in the form of an AI, it's not quite over yet. We get a call from Kars, reminding us that there's still some loose ends to tie up, namely when it comes to Metal Gear Zeke and Zadornov. This is hands down the worst part of the game, but let me be clear, that's primarily because of how this endgame section's been implemented, and how it doesn't only not match up with how the entirety of Peace Walker's structure has been handled up till this point, but also doesn't match up with pretty much anything we've ever seen from the series. And that all comes down to one key word: grind. That's right, a Metal Gear that features gameplay where you're made to not only grind through incredibly repetitive main ops, but in the case of Zeke, identical boss fights that we've already beaten previously. While the endgame does still open up some really great side ops, the way we acquire the true ending of this game is one of the weirdest choices this game makes. The completion of Metal Gear Zeke, which we're shown all the way throughout the game is optional and only has an effect on the outer ops, is now mandatory. If you don't have the parts, you've got to go back to any of the previous AI fights and beat the boss without damaging the mech's parts. parts. In theory, but I don't mind that, because you're technically getting more bang for your buck. You're being made to go back to things we've already completed, now with a different motive. However, when you start breaking it down, this is, in my eyes, one of the least satisfying ways to cap off a story I could possibly imagine. Firstly, the parts you're given at the end of each fight are random, meaning you might have to fight these bosses several times over if you end up damaging the parts you need. And also, if you're lacking a significant amount of the parts by the time you reach this point, repeating the fights is already a given. What were initially pretty fun bosses now can turn into an absolute slog. The fun can be sucked out in such a short amount of time if we don't get the correct parts, or damage them and have to start the fight again. And bear in mind as well, this is how we reach the end of the story. It's not being carried out in a particularly well done way at all. It might be taking max advantage of the boss fights throughout the game, but at what cost? There's a complete separation being made now, while still trying to link things together. What do these fights now mean? The AI pod's dead, and we've destroyed all these mechs before. The point is, it wouldn't be an issue if this was side content, or we were just repeating a boss fight on our own. It's like reaching the final part of a game and then being told we aren't the right level yet. Sorry, we know you've just gone through the microwave sequence, we know you've just gone through arsenal gear and fended off against a horde of rays, but you just haven't ticked this box, so go back and play what you've just played to get the actual ending. Again, the issue isn't the replaying itself, but I love games that present a great amount of replay value. It's about how this is tying into the story. When we talk about replay value in games, we're referring to things like when players start a whole new game, or when a game presents a vast array of additional gameplay options that will keep players coming back. But as you would have guessed, in those cases, this very rarely plays into that actual plot. And what's even worse for me is how all this stuff is totally ignored in Peace Walker. We can understand what's going on in terms of the game design, but how does it make sense for Snake to be returning to boss fights that he's already beaten, with gear that he's acquired from beating them the first time round? Well, it doesn't, and the game doesn't really seem to care. We're judging this game by mainline Metal Gear standards, and it's not good enough to me to just say it's a PSP game, it's a more arcadey experience. The ties this game has to the main plot are too strong for those arguments to just be given out in that way, because at that point, the series as a whole starts losing its meaning. We all know this is a fictional series with unrealistic foes and unrealistic set pieces, but if you throw the rulebook out the window in this kind of way, why should I take any of it seriously? Moving past that, however, as I'm sure there'll be people who don't have too many issues with going through previous boss fights, there's an even bigger issue in my opinion when it comes to the Zadornov missions. These are the true final missions that close out the game, a drawn out series of hide and seek escapades where we head back into the maps we previously explored, tracking down Zadornov and bringing him back to Mother Base. Not only does this feel even more repetitive and drawn out in comparison to the boss fights, it also makes just as little sense. If we're viewing it in the cold light of endgame grindy gameplay, but I think these are so much worse than acquiring the Metal Gear parts, as even in those instances, we've got a set goal that should be able to be beaten increasingly more effectively, depending on how many times we go up against certain bosses. And even if we don't learn how all these bosses tick, the fights do not go on that long regardless, especially with the high tier weaponry we're carrying at this point in the game. These Zadornov missions just become downright tedious, and that's not mentioning there's a grand total of 6, that's right, 6 of these to go through. What initially seems like quite a funny gag about Zadornov somehow always finding a way to escape quickly becomes a nightmare when being plunged back into an area we've already explored, with enemies that no longer pose any significant threat just to extract a guy. It's no different to the extraction side ops we would have been doing already, with the added bonus of having a much wider area for Zadornov to hide in, and once again, having this be part of the actual story, despite making no sense. How in God's name does this guy not just escape Mother Base this amount of times, but also end up back in Costa Rica and Nicaragua every time? Surely you'd think he'd go somewhere different, but of course he won't. This is a game, and these are areas that are being repurposed to fulfill their max potential, even though in my opinion, the side ops already do a fine enough job at that. Yeah, as I said, a really bizarre way to close out a game that, aside from the cliffhangers at the end of certain missions, makes a clear distinction between its main ops and side ops. There's parts of it I love, and parts of it I hate. Because of how this final part of the game has been implemented, am I now having to seriously believe the big boss we've known about throughout the years spent his time shooting down men floating from balloons and fighting dinosaurs? What about his time spent hunting monkeys? What about Solid Snake and Raiden performing kickflips around the big shell? The rational answer is no, of course I'm not, because none of that would make sense when it comes to the overall plot. But the lack of clarification in Peace Walker leaves all that stuff up in the air. You could try bat it away with merely common sense, but where's the common sense in furthering the main story by fighting bosses that were already destroyed, and having Zadornov escape several times to areas we've already been to in the past? All of this depends on how much you care about series continuity, and the silliness that becomes somewhat overwhelming towards the back end of this game. If you don't care that much to think too deep into these things and take the grind for exactly what it is, it really shouldn't bother you too much. You know what's being achieved here, here, and can separate the main story from the nonsensical events we carry out ourselves in-game. If you're someone who doesn't take these things at face value, however, which I think you can rightfully do here, it should be a bit more of a problem, as ultimately, when you break it down, from its conception, Metal Gear has always had goofy elements, but it was never a goofy series, whereas Peace Walker seems to be portraying the exact opposite here. Nothing appears to make all that much sense, but it's still being linked to the main plot. And wrapping up these Zadornov missions, aside from the tonal elements that I just talked about at length, these just become so boring after only 1 or 2 missions. You run through a map until you find Zadornov, and that's it. The only mission I found even remotely interesting is the final one, that leads us into the true ending of the game, where Zadornov is simply said to be on the loose, with no indication this time about where he's actually gone.
We've got no idea where he is. Snake, think you can find him?
We can't just let him run around. Makes us look bad.
I'll say. Since we can't locate him, I'm afraid I can't add a new mission.
And this is something that I think some players will either love or hate, depending on how they feel about searching up the answers online. Because the only way to find him this time round is to 1. Have Metal Gear Zeke fully complete, and 2. Have an intel team of level 40. Already 2 things the player may or may not have, without being informed at all they're necessary to progress. But upon acquiring these 2 things, we can head into the 1st or 3rd side ops, and find Zadornov hiding in the firing range. Now this is on that side of obscure, where I imagine not many players will be finding Zadornov here legitimately, but for someone like me, I don't personally have a problem with it. I can see why someone would have a problem, but at the same time, I can also appreciate the unknown factor that comes along with it. The game tells us he could literally be anywhere, and just leaves us to go find him, a task that I definitely couldn't complete myself without consulting Google, but one that even despite my cheating nature, I still found to be quite a good idea. The best and possibly worst part for me is what awaits us at the end of this long slog, being given some of the only fully animated and expansive in-game cutscenes we see throughout the game, but also having us go up against our very own creation, Zeke, with numerous variables being shown off in-game that I find fantastic. It's actually Paz who's taken over Zeke, revealing that she's been working for Zero the entire time, and wants to take the Metal Gear back with her. Already, as you can see from my gameplay, the appearance of Zeke entirely depends on how you personally customized it. Whatever paint job you slapped onto it, whatever accessories you added, how many AI parts have been inputted, all of it is represented in-game, already giving the fight a more personal feel straight away. This isn't just the Metal Gear Zeke battle, this is a fight against your Metal Gear Zeke, with the broad amount of customization options that are on offer, leaving large room for the fight to never appear identical between several playthroughs. What's even better is the more gameplay focused components like the AI parts we're able to input, with everything that was said to be improved in Zeke, like its maneuverability and damage output, actually being represented in the boss fight as well. That's right, this is a boss where depending on how much effort you put into making Zeke the Metal Gear to be reckoned with, it might actually come back to bite you in this fight, as with the more or less AI parts it has, it'll be noticeably easier or harder to deal with. As for the fight itself, I don't think I'd have any issue with anyone saying this is their favourite boss in the game. Zeke not only appears fantastic, but as I said, I love the more personal element this fight presents, by having us destroy our own creation, while also taking someone down with it who we thought was an ally. Its attacks are what we've come to expect from all these large mechs, bullets that get fired from turrets, rockets, and even a railgun. I do love how agile Zeke proves itself to be, dashing around the arena at a pretty fast pace, and leaping high into the air and landing on the several different platforms that surround the main arena. There's a real sense of scale to this fight that I really enjoy, and I like the idea of fighting on Mother Base itself. It's literally only in this final mission where we get a good visual on the Metal Gear and our base that we've been building up throughout the entire game. And although I'd usually say it's a missed opportunity to have not taken advantage of these elements a bit more, with hindsight, we see that's exactly what MGS5 does. So I imagine the motivation would have already been there to flesh out Mother Base, and have it be a physical place that we can frequently visit. As despite us never really visiting Mother Base in this game, having a conflict break out like this in what's essentially our home presents fantastic stakes. The fight alone feels like a showdown, but having it intrude on our base makes it feel even more personal, like some kind of invasion. The one unique thing about this boss compared to the others are the interactable rockets that we can activate, dealing a pretty high amount of damage. It's strange that we only see the inclusion of an external damage source solely in this fight. I think it encourages the player to pay even closer attention to the movements of Zeke, and puts more emphasis on the player's own timing and movement, as if you take too long, Zeke will just move away. Amazingly, one thing I have heard can be a make or break for the community with this fight, however, is something that's usually placed on the back burner for most players, and that's the music. Not featuring any grandiose orchestra, or even a fast-paced electro track, but instead an all-out pop track, which is actually sung by the Japanese voice actor of Paz. I can understand why some people don't like this, as it doesn't really create a great deal of tension, or match the situation all that appropriately. But to me, it's very obvious this juxtaposing effect was very much intentional. It is still quite epic in its own right, just not in the same vein as the previous boss music. A pretty good fight all round. For what it lacks in uniqueness, being yet another fight where our approach is near identical to previous boss fights, it makes up for with the additional story implications. It's something that I felt was drastically missing for the vast majority of fights throughout this game, and I think has a detrimental effect on Peace Walker's legacy. Yeah, I think it's that deep. Boss fights and bosses in general have always been a big part of the Metal Gear series, and Peace Walkers, while not being bad, have near to no weight to them. Yeah, you could say there's something interesting about all our fights against the AI pod being an echo from our legendary fight against the boss, but that's really conjecture. It doesn't feel that way. Unlike Zeke, where we're actively being taunted by Paz and attacked by our own twisted creation, fights like the Pupa, the Cocoon, they just feel too generic. And you'd notice this is also the case with almost every single fight against the mechs in the past. Not only was it less of an issue in previous games, as we were actually being given the opportunity to fight bosses that weren't towering Goliaths, but even when we were, you had Metal Gear Rex being piloted by Liquid, the Shagohod being piloted by Volgin, Metal Gear Ray being controlled by Liquid once again. It's pretty obvious to see that having a key antagonist take the reins of these mechanical beasts was very important, so it's odd to see nothing like that for almost the entirety of Peace Walker. There's no taunting like Paz does here from the AI pods, instead just command after command being executed, thus leading to several missed opportunities for certain fights that could have been seen as series highlights, all because there's no emotional weight and no stakes, nothing aside from their designs that really sticks out. Defeating Zeke takes us to the final cutscene, one that I find to be arguably the most important when observing the flip that finally gets switched, turning Snake into Big Boss. It's a very interesting scene to look at, as the entire interaction we see between Snake and Kaz sums up exactly how the figure of Big Boss came to be. Kaz basically outs himself as an outright traitor, saying he knew the true intentions of Paz and Zadornov the entire time.
Look, boss. I owe you an apology. Hear me out, okay?
Sure.
I knew Paz and the Professor. I knew who they really were all along.
Cuz...
I used them.
I suppose you were the one that brought them to Columbia in the first place, huh?
Guilty as charged.
He knew Paz was linked to Zero, and according to him, used them to build up the strong MSF foundation that we're standing on right now. But he didn't really use them, he used us, he used Snake. Kaz is the instigator in all of this. He absolutely manipulated the situation to get exactly what he wanted from the start. It all goes back to their debate at the start of the game of either staying nomads or setting up Mother Base. Big Boss without a doubt isn't innocent in all this. He is the one who's responsible for building up this mercenary business. But he was either staying willfully ignorant or was genuinely unaware of what the true purpose of all this was. This was never about simply being a gun for hire. Big Boss, Kaz, and the MSF took sides during this mission, and have now put themselves on the map. But Big Boss refuses to back down at this point. He sees what they've done as a point of no return, implying in his final line that he now aims to turn the MSF into exactly what he wanted to avoid: a nation.
The hunt is on, Kaz. And the whole world's on our tail. Assemble the men.
This is the very start of what would soon be known as Outer Heaven. Big Boss is no longer following in the footsteps of the boss. The boss's will no longer appears to be what his decisions are being based off. Big Boss and Kaz literally discuss the idea of a war economy that'll eventually come to fruition by the time MGS4 rolls around.
In the new age, armies won't be tied to states, and war will become a business. We'll be a valuable commodity. There'll be clients all over the world who need our services.
This is something both of them thrive off. Big Boss and Zero, despite holding opposing views at this point, ultimately end up carrying out the same kind of thing at two different points of time. Big Boss during the 20th century, and Zero taking over in the 21st. Big Boss here shows where his motivations are. He cares about the soldier, and wants to create a place for men to come and fight. Not for any collective goal or purpose, but merely to fight on the battlefield. Zero in many ways saw the much bigger picture. He wanted total control. It's strange that Big Boss and Zero's interpretations of the boss's will get get discussed so much, because in my eyes, they're two completely different things. As we've seen in Peace Walker, Big Boss's motivations are nowhere near as grand and totalitarian as Zero's. He wants to carve out a path where he and his men can do what they're best at. The idea of peace is established across the course of this game as not really being peace at all. The closest the world can get to peace is deterrence, and while we haven't yet reached the stage where Big Boss is creating nukes of his own, he's labeling the MSF as a deterrence in itself, just to whoever hires them. It's all about breaking free for Big Boss, the location of their mother base making even more sense thematically. It's just him and his army in the middle of the ocean. This is where we can see the biggest differences between Solid Snake and Big Boss. Snake, just like his father, spent his whole life fighting, but for the right reasons. He was cleaning up the mess that Big Boss and Zero had created in the first place. It was never about carving out his own path, looking for control, creating an army. Big Boss is bitter. He wants revenge on Zero. He wants nothing to do with any of the powerful nations across the world. He fights because he enjoys it and can expand his army and mother base. These are not the reasons Snake fights. Snake, as he explains in MGS1, inherently enjoys fighting. It's built into his DNA, but he can ultimately see right from wrong better than anyone else in the series. He fights in hopes that the fighting can stop altogether, and in turn ends up following the boss's will much better than Big Boss or Zero ever could. With the close emotional attachment removed and a total lack of any kind of ego or hunger for power, Snake turns into the soldier that Big Boss should have always been. Aside from being a really enjoyable experience from start to finish, I think the events of Peace Walker end up really enhancing our view of Snake by showcasing the many shortcomings of Big Boss. A lot of the choices he's made came from circumstance, but that doesn't make them any less right or wrong. Big Boss in reality ends up fighting purely for himself by the end of the game, whereas Snake fights for the betterment of the world and its people. And coming to the end of Peace Walker, I have to say that aside from a few road bumps along the way, this is a surprisingly great experience, even when looking at it outside the vacuum of being the PSP mainline game. The gameplay feels significantly more refined compared to the last PSP offering. The graphics and performance, while being almost identical on the PSP itself, are improved upon immensely when looking at the HD collection. And when it comes to the story, I will say it's not all that necessary at this point, but it doesn't do any harm either. It only enhances the overall story. I would say ever since MGS3, however, that's kind of how I felt about the stories in all the Metal Gears when boiling them down. It still feels like these games weren't ever really supposed to be made if Kojima got his way, and that's only gotten stronger and stronger with each new game. For me, we've reached a point where Kojima's genuinely running out of meaningful things to say. Outside of the focus on literal events that now takes up the bulk of the experience, the larger themes Kojima was known for tackling now feel like we're pretty much retreading old ground. We've had the anti-war messages, we've looked at the dangers of nuclear weapons. I really don't know how much longer you can focus on this topic until it just becomes a bit stale. A sentiment Kojima himself must have felt to a certain degree, with the upcoming MGS5 taking its story in some pretty insane directions, appearing like nothing more than Kojima wanting to get something off his chest that doesn't really fit into the series' core themes. But on the whole, Peace Walker is pretty great. Coming back to the precursor thing I mentioned at the start of this, we'll eventually see that all of the gameplay concepts that are introduced in this game get heavily expanded on and refined in MGS5, which I feel might turn some players away from this game if they've already played 5. You might think, well, that's exactly what's happened in the entire series so far, and while that's true, despite enjoying Peace Walker for what it is, I still find that for me personally, there's not only a lot less stuff calling me back to play again, but also more stuff that pushes me away as well. Things like the cutscenes are a big draw. I absolutely love the art style, and I know for a fact the only way I'll get to experience these are by playing either Peace Walker or Portable Ops, and I'd much rather play Peace Walker in that scenario. But when it comes to a situation where I'm deciding which Metal Gear I want to play out of the entire catalogue, I can't deny, Peace Walker's still quite far down that list. It hasn't got the iconic characters and amazing voice acting from the first game, it hasn't got the profound insight from the second, it hasn't got the amazing gameplay from the third, and it hasn't got the graphical fidelity from the fourth. This confirms my belief that ditching the 5 in this game's title was such a wise decision, because no matter how much you like this game as an individual thing, it just doesn't stack up to the previous games in so many ways. The best parts are the unique elements that only Peace Walker has, which, as I say, are things like the cutscenes, the co-op multiplayer, and until MGS5 came out, a fully realised base building element with RPG-style leveling systems and upgrades. For a Metal Gear on-the-go experience, I don't think you could do much better, as in that context, it still fits in with any of the other mainline games. You can tell it's been made to accompany the handheld, whereas the others demand a lot more of your attention and a lot more of your time. But all in all, due to how the events of this game are heavily referenced at points in MGS5, it's definitely a must play if you're aiming to get a more well-rounded understanding of all the series events. I will say, however, expectations need to be managed perhaps more than any other Metal Gear we've seen. Just because this is a game that's been released after MGS4 does not mean it excels or even matches every element of that game, because it's just not possible. The main antagonist of the game, Coldman, we never actually fight, but never see in-game. I've talked about the bosses for long enough, but they're undeniably repetitive. There's no human bosses at all, not a single one. But on the other hand, this game to me felt like a really smooth experience, up until the end game of course. There's something quite satisfying about ticking off mission after mission, a real sense of progress being established. And coming off the back of the mammoth that was MGS4, it's definitely refreshing to have a Metal Gear that's far more succinct, not getting caught up in hour-long discussions about the Patriots and ideologies, but instead laying out a plot that's rather simplistic and having the player spend most of their time actually playing the game, which I mean might actually be more appealing to those who aren't real hardcore Metal Gear fans. Peace Walker's great, it's also flawed. I understand why it's flawed, and I'm left in a position where I don't know how I should really judge it. I wouldn't have any problems playing this one again, but it also would never be my first choice. In my opinion, it's one of the best and most impressive PSP games, but one of the least impressive mainline Metal Gears. I ultimately think it should still be experienced by fans of the series, but although it does encourage replay value, after I'm done with it, there's a very slim chance I'll be picking it back up in comparison to playing MGS 1 or 2. That's just me though. I'm aware there's lots of people who adore Peace Walker, and I think that's great. To me, it just feels like a good game that strays a bit too far from the Metal Gear formula to feel all that enticing for me to return to. This is a world where we do have options, so I'm not being forced to play Peace Walker. And if I'm in the mood to play a Metal Gear game, I'm not sure Peace Walker ends up fitting a lot of those requirements. Coming out of Peace Walker, we reach yet another pretty massive gap between mainline releases, with there technically being a 5-year wait between Peace Walker and MGS5. With me saying technically, due to many people seeing the first part of MGS5, that being Ground Zeroes, as nothing more than a tech demo. In between this time, however, we actually end up getting what I see as the biggest and possibly best Metal Gear related spin-off. That, of course, being Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, being released in 2013 and not actually being made by Kojima Productions, but instead the well-renowned Platinum Games, who before Metal Gear Rising were arguably best known for their games Bayonetta, as well as Okami and God Hand when they were known as Clover Studio. And if you were at all familiar with those games, you knew straight away that Metal Gear Rising wasn't going to be anything like the Solid games, and looking at pretty much anything related to the game, that becomes apparent immediately. There's lots of contrasting things I remember about Metal Gear Rising, as it's around this time where I wasn't just starting to go through the entire Metal Gear catalogue myself, but also was reaching an age where I was really starting to appreciate the more mature themes. Fan reaction at the time felt pretty sour when it came to Rising, from what I remember at least. It had been years since we last got a proper Metal Gear game at this point, with many fans not even touching Peace Walker due to it being on the PSP. So to now hear the next Metal Gear not only wasn't being developed by Kojima Productions, wasn't being directed by Kojima himself, and was now a high-octane hack-and-slash experience where we're in control of Raiden once again, there was a lot going against it on the run-up to its release. But I'd definitely say that as time's gone on, whether it be down to the numerous memes that have spawned from this game or whatever, this game has without a doubt had a massive critical re-evaluation. I surely can't be the only one who remember the disappointment from fans when Rising came out, and it was pretty understandable. This was something that didn't resemble a Metal Gear game whatsoever, but I think fans now understand that it was never trying to be. And as for the game itself, I can't deny, despite how I used to have these internal sour grapes for whatever reason, Metal Gear Rising is a game that I've returned to time and time again because of one key element, the gameplay. Now interestingly, when looking back at the development of Metal Gear Rising, I feel like the initial version of this project would have actually been quite a bit different. For many, this is the biggest disappointment that hangs over Rising: Revengeance, as the whole conception of the project did still come from Kojima. The game was initially being titled Metal Gear Solid Rising, as opposed to Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, and was set to be the first game developed using the brand new Fox engine, the engine that were going to be used for MGS5, and still being one of the best game engines I've personally ever witnessed. There's a lot of things from these initial tech demos that we can see were actually carried over to Revengeance. Features like the Blade mode remain incredibly impressive, where we can slow down time and slice an object or enemy with high precision, and also have that slice accurately reflected. You position the blade to slice off a person's arm, their arm gets sliced off. You position it on their torso, they get cut in half. The amount of destruction is also reflected very well in Revengeance. Almost every single object around the environment can be cut in half or destroyed. Any kind of barricade, lamppost, we can even cut down the foundations of certain bridges and watch them collapse. Mechanically, it's still a system that holds up really well. In terms of the raw gameplay when it comes to fighting enemies, it does feel like your typical hack and slash experience. For the average player, you're essentially going to be mashing the attack attack buttons until the enemy's either dead or a part of his body turns blue, in which you can then activate the blade mode and slice them in half. The blade mode being encouraged even more in these instances, by having a health regen lie at the core of most enemies. Although I will say, the animation that's shown every single time does get tiresome after a while. We can perform combos, we have additional equipment like rocket launchers and cardboard boxes, that to be honest are pretty useless for the most part, and eventually we're even given the option to upgrade Raiden and deck him out with new outfits and weapons. There's tons of stuff to acquire here. The replay value that's presented from the upgrade screen alone is fantastic. The game itself is already a satisfying enough experience to warrant a second playthrough, but the sheer amount of additional weapons, combos, and customization options are almost impossible to acquire fully in only one playthrough. The story isn't really worth mentioning. It is canon, I suppose, taking place after MGS4 and having Raiden return to combat despite pretty much vowing never to do so. But the plot is just utterly insane. There's hardly any links to the Solid series outside of meeting Sonny towards the end of the game, and it's kind of hard to get really involved when the game itself doesn't seem to be taking itself seriously at all. Unless you've played this game several times over, but I don't think any of the characters are memorable, apart from Raiden obviously, who reaches his absolute peak of awesomeness in this game. Let's just say that this is a game where you start off fighting a Metal Gear Ray, where in the midst of that fight you end up flinging it into the air and slicing it in half with only a sword, and by the end of the game, the big bad villain is revealed to be the Senator of Colorado.
You're American. You're number one.
Yeah, no wonder this guy became a full-on meme.
The memes.
It's so ridiculous, but don't mistake that for being bad at all. This is all playing into the sheer insanity of Metal Gear Rising. It's a game where the main focus is all revolved around killing enemies with your sword. It never tries to reach the same thematic heights as the other Metal Gears, so I don't think you can really judge it on that same basis. On PC, the game looks fantastic, even today, and performance is great, and unless I'm mistaken, I think I felt the same about the console releases too. We're well past the point of the early days of the 7th generation, and although I would say I prefer the overall look of a game like MGS4, there's no doubt in my mind that Metal Gear Rising looks just as fantastic, with far more happening on screen at pretty much all times, while running so much better. I think your enjoyment of Metal Gear Rising will all depend on how much you enjoyed the previous games, how important the idea of canon is to you, and if you even enjoy this format of video game. Because let's not mistake, outside of games like the Acid spin-offs, this is the most substantial instance of a Metal Gear being released that's absolutely nothing like a Metal Gear game. But it's undeniable, there's tons of stuff to praise with this game. Yeah, the story might not be that great, and I don't think an underwhelming story can just be given a pass, because the devs know it's not great. But the name of the game here is gameplay, and in that regard, Revengeance absolutely excels. This game features some of the most insane action set pieces we've ever seen in the series. The boss fights, while not having memorable villains, are all brilliant. The visuals we get in some of these, and the sheer scale that's presented, is phenomenal at points. I love the amount of different environments we get transitioned to across the game, which, as I say, whether it be a densely packed city, high-tech labs, or countryside, all look really good. It can't be understated how detailed and realised all these locations are, despite not being a game that really warrants the player slowing down and observing their surroundings. When you do, you won't be left disappointed whatsoever. And good lord, this game does not play around when it comes to the Metal Gears. The fight against Ray at the beginning is iconic at this point, a firm statement from Platinum Games telling us this isn't your typical Metal Gear experience. But by the time we reach the end, we end up facing off against Metal Gear Excelsus, the while featuring quite a standard boss fight where you wait for it to attack and then launch a counter-attack. It's hands down the biggest, most impressive Metal Gear I think the series has to offer. Is it insane? Yes. But is it awesome at the same time? You bet. And that basically sums up how I personally look at Metal Gear Rising. It's a game where I can ultimately just switch my brain off for a while and enjoy hacking and slashing whatever foe stands in my way. I'm glad we've reached the point where Rising isn't just being written off as a goofy Metal Gear game, as I feel for a long time the genuine positives this game had to offer were being ignored, solely because of how it doesn't really fit in with the prior games. The combat is absolutely fantastic. It leaves me in a similar situation to when I played Insomniac's Spider-Man, where I find myself coming back to the game again and again, for no other purpose than to interact with the gameplay system. In the case of Spider-Man, it was the web swinging, and in the case of Rising, it's the incredibly well-designed to and fro we feel from the combat system, as well as the blade mode. The pace is something that feels perfect to me in all facets. Just like how our actions in-game feel snappy and fast, so too does the game itself. As long as you're actively enjoying the combat, you'll find the time will just fly by. It sticks to a set formula, one that's very strong, and hardly ever differs from it. For some, that will genuinely lead to a feeling of repetitiveness, but I view that as more personal taste compared to anything else, as when it comes down to it, there's enough experimentation and depth in the combat system to where I find it rather hard to objectively criticize. As I said, the extent of my problems pretty much come down to the QuickTime events that frequently pop up, but even then, it's nothing I'd get too hung up on. The recent Doom games feature a essentially the exact same thing, and it doesn't seem like many players have a problem with it in that case either. So yeah, Metal Gear Rising on the whole was a very different Metal Gear experience, but one that should still ultimately appeal to hardcore fans. Even if the gameplay might not be your cup of tea, this is chronologically the last game in the series. That should interest a lot of fans from the get-go. But even then, we do see even more remnants of the past games the further we get into the experience. The reappearance of the geckos, dwarf geckos, and sliders from MGS4, being able to see Raiden take on the Jack the Ripper moniker at certain points, even becoming a gameplay feature where we can activate this Ripper mode and kill essentially any enemy in 1 or 2 hits. Even though the focus may not really be on the Metal Gear canon, it doesn't just disregard it entirely. There are still things along the way that longtime fans will be able to appreciate. All in all for me, I still really enjoy Metal Gear Rising. It looks great, it plays great, and Jesus, some of the songs featured in the soundtrack are brilliant. I'd advise any fan of the Metal Gear series, any fan of Platinum Games, and any fan of the hack and slash genre in general to give this game a try if you haven't already. It knows exactly what it is, and never tries to be anything else except an all-out good time. It may not be the stealth espionage action we're used to in the Metal Gear series, but it perfectly captures exactly what I wanted from a game where we finally get to play as the amped up Raiden we saw in MGS4. Goofy, yes. Entertaining, undoubtedly. And a game that I think has the best attempt to bring in new fans to the Metal Gear series, who initially may have been perturbed by its reputation of having slower stealth gameplay and insanely drawn out cutscenes. A success on almost all accounts, but perception does matter here. You have to view this game for what it is, not what you wanted or hoped for it to be.